The fear epidemic, the beginning of change. In the quiet, dusty archives of Paris rests a peculiar set of documents from the late 18th century. These are not grand treaties or royal decrees, but rather humble death certificates. And on many of them, the physician simply wrote the cause of death as fear. It is a chilling and medically inaccurate diagnosis that speaks volumes about the psychological atmosphere of a nation on the brink of deep, violent change. We often think of history in terms of battles and laws, of grand figures making loud pronouncements. But what happens when an entire society becomes so consumed by anxiety, suspicion, and dread that its own collective heart begins to fail? How can the soul of a nation become so sick that fear itself becomes a certified cause of death? This disturbing enigma lies at the heart of the story we are about to explore, the story of the French Revolution. It is a story that begins not with an explosion, but with a long, slow, smoldering fever of discontent that would eventually erupt, transforming the world forever. Tonight, we will journey back to that fevered time, into a world of gilded palaces and starving peasants, of radical ideas and unthinkable violence. I'm glad you are here. I wish you peace, rest, and perhaps a little historical inspiration before you sleep. Our story begins in a world that on the surface seemed as eternal and unchanging as the heavens themselves. This was the France of the Ancien Régime, the Old Order, a society built on centuries of tradition, faith, and a deeply entrenched system of hierarchy. This structure was organized like a great pyramid, with God at the top, the king just below, and the rest of society arranged in descending layers of importance. This structure was formalized into three great social classes, or estates. At the very top was the first estate, the clergy. These were the men of the church, from the most humble parish priest tending to his rural flock, to the incredibly wealthy and influential cardinals and archbishops who moved in the highest circles of power. The church was more than just a spiritual institution. It was a state within a state. It owned between 10 to 15% of all land in France. It collected its own tax, the tithe, la dîme, from the peasantry, and held immense influence over every aspect of life, from birth to marriage to death. It was the keeper of knowledge, the educator of the youth, and the moral authority of the kingdom. To question the church was, in a very real sense, to question the order of the universe itself. Just beneath them, occupying the second step of the pyramid, was the second estate, the nobility. These were the descendants of the old feudal lords, a class whose entire identity was rooted in the profession of arms and the ownership of land. They were the dukes, marquises, and counts who held vast ancestral estates and viewed themselves as the natural leaders of society. Their privileges were ancient and sweeping. They were largely exempt from paying most taxes, a right stemming from the old feudal idea that they paid their dues to the kingdom in blood by leading its armies rather than in cash. They held a monopoly on the highest offices in the army, government, and church, and they enjoyed unique feudal rights, or droits seigneuriaux, over the peasants who lived on their lands, the right to hunt on peasant fields, the right to demand labor for a certain number of days a year, the right to mill grain at the lord's mill for a fee. While some of the provincial nobility were relatively poor, clinging to a crumbling shadow and a faded title, the great aristocrats at court lived lives of unimaginable splendor. The economic engine, the Third Estate, and Versailles. This was the vast, sprawling category that encompassed 97% of the French population. It included the wealthy merchants of the port cities, the lawyers and doctors of the rising middle class, known as the bourgeoisie, the urban artisans and shopkeepers, blacksmiths, bakers, and carpenters who filled the noisy streets of Paris, and, by far the largest group, It included 20 million peasants who toiled in the fields, their lives regulated by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of their landlords and the tax collector. The third estate was France's economic engine. They were the ones who produced the food, created the goods, and most crucially, paid nearly all the taxes. From the salt tax to the tithe and the hated taille, the land tax from which the other two estates were exempt, the burden of funding the kingdom, its endless wars, and its extravagant court fell squarely on their shoulders. A popular political caricature of the time captured this reality perfectly. It depicted a hunchbacked old peasant with a hoe, carrying a well-fed bishop and a lavishly dressed nobleman upon his back. This single image embodied the fundamental injustice of the old order. The productive majority was crushed under the weight of the privileged minority. The ultimate symbol of this gilded, unequal world was the magnificent Palace of Versailles. Located a dozen miles outside Paris, it was not merely a royal residence, it was the gravitational center of the entire French universe. Begun by Louis XIV, the Sun King, it had been transformed from a modest hunting lodge into the most opulent and awe-inspiring palace in all of Europe. A breathtaking spectacle of manicured gardens, glittering chandeliers, and the famous Hall of Mirrors. Here, the king presided over a court life that was a masterpiece of political theater. Every moment of the king's day, from his waking, or lever, to his going to bed, or coucher, was regulated by a labyrinth of rules and etiquette. Thousands of nobles vied for the honor of attending these rituals, competing for a glance from the king, a whispered word, or a favorable position in the room. This was done deliberately. The Sun King had consciously created this suffocating, narcissistic world to domesticate his powerful nobility. By luring them to Versailles and locking them into this endless cycle of ceremony and social intrigue, he transformed them from dangerous, independent feudal lords into fawning courtiers whose power relied entirely on royal favor. The great puzzle for historians is how deeply the French people believed in this system. For centuries, most accepted it as natural, divinely ordained. The king was the father of his people. And even when life was hard, loyalty to the throne was absolute. But by the late 18th century, the glue holding that ancient pyramid together was beginning to dissolve, and the brilliant facade of Versailles could no longer hide the deep cracks forming at its base. While the highest nobility were locked in the golden cage of Versailles, enacting their elaborate rituals of status, a quiet but profound revolution was taking place in the minds of their countrymen. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual and cultural movement that swept across Europe in the 18th century, and its epicenter was undeniably Paris. The Enlightenment championed the power of human reason as the primary tool for understanding the universe and improving the human condition. Thinkers, known as the philosophes, applied the principles of scientific inquiry that had so successfully unlocked the secrets of the physical world to the far messier realms of society, government, and religion. They cast a cold, skeptical eye on traditions that had been accepted for centuries, questioning everything from the divine right of kings to the dogmas of the Catholic Church. To them, tradition was not a source of wisdom, but a potential source of error and superstition that needed to be scrutinized, tested, and if found wanting, discarded. One of the sharpest and most famous of these intellectual swordsmen was Voltaire, the brilliant writer, poet, and playwright. He was a master of satire and wielded it with devastating force against the two pillars of the old order, the monarchy and the church. He famously declared, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," a powerful embodiment of his belief in free speech. He tirelessly attacked religious intolerance, superstition, and the immense, often corrupt power of the established church. His writings were filled with a biting wit that made powerful men wince, and made his readers feel like they were part of a clever, enlightened club that saw the world as it truly was. He did not necessarily call for the overthrow of the monarchy, but his constant attacks on its abuses and its claims to divine authority did the work of 1,000 revolutionary pamphlets, slowly eroding the reverence in which the old institutions were held. The prophets of a new world, Rousseau and Montesquieu. If Voltaire was the great critic of the old world, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the visionary prophet of the new. A more sentimental and radical thinker, Rousseau concerned himself with the nature of liberty and the sources of inequality. In his seminal work, The Social Contract, he put forth a revolutionary idea. He argued that the only legitimate authority was that which had the consent of the governed. He rejected the notion that the king ruled by the will of God. Instead, he proposed that true sovereignty, the ultimate right to power, resided not in the monarch, but in the people themselves, in what he called the general will. The king was thus not a master, but a servant of the people, and if he failed to serve their interests, they had every right to replace him. This was political dynamite. It redefined the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, transforming subjects into citizens and obedience from a sacred duty into a conditional agreement. His ideas about the noble savage and the corrupting influence of society resonated deeply with those who felt alienated and oppressed by the artificial hierarchies of the Ancien Régime. Meanwhile, another influential thinker, Baron de Montesquieu, proposed a practical blueprint for how a just and free government could be structured. Himself an aristocrat, Montesquieu studied the political systems of different countries and was a great admirer of the English system of constitutional monarchy. In his work, The Spirit of the Laws, he argued that the best way to prevent any government from becoming tyrannical was to divide its powers. He proposed the separation of powers into 3 distinct branches: the executive, the king, the legislative, parliament, and the judicial, the courts. By setting these different branches against each other, with each acting as a check and balance on the others, the system would prevent too much power from accumulating in one person or group, thereby protecting the liberty of the citizens. This elegant concept would have a profound impact not only on the French revolutionaries, but also on the American founding fathers. These were not merely abstract theories discussed in dusty studies. They were thrilling, dangerous, and intoxicating ideas that spread with astonishing speed throughout French society. They were debated in the elegant salons of Paris, where aristocratic women hosted gatherings of the nation's sharpest minds to discuss art, politics, and philosophy over coffee. They were argued over in the hundreds of new coffee houses that sprung up across the city, places where middle-class men could read the latest newspapers and pamphlets and engage in lively political discourse. And most significantly, they were disseminated through the printed word. The crowning achievement of the French Enlightenment was the Encyclopédie, a massive multi-volume compendium of human knowledge, edited by Denis Diderot. On the surface, it was a straightforward encyclopedia, with articles on everything from anatomy to zinc mining. But woven throughout its pages was a subtle yet insistent critique of the existing order. Its articles on government implicitly favored reason and popular consent over divine right, and its articles on religious topics treated Christian dogma with detached, scientific skepticism. The government and the church rightly considered it a deeply subversive work and attempted to suppress it, but it was too popular. It became a bestseller, spreading the critical spirit of the Enlightenment into every corner of the kingdom. The great historical debate is over how deeply these ideas penetrated the various layers of society. The catalyst: financial crisis. Did the average peasant in the field truly care about Rousseau's concept of the general will? Probably not directly, but these ideas created a new critical vocabulary and a new set of expectations, especially among the educated and ambitious members of the Third Estate. Lawyers, journalists, and local officials began speaking of citizenship, natural rights, and the nation. They began viewing the injustice of the tax system and the privileges of the nobility not as an annoying but inevitable part of life, but as a violation of rational and just social order. The Enlightenment did not cause the French Revolution, but it created the intellectual and cultural framework that made it possible. It gave the revolutionaries the language to articulate their grievances and a vision of a better, more rational, and more just world to replace the one they sought to destroy. The old pyramid, built on faith and tradition, was now under attack by the powerful new forces of reason and skepticism. Ideas, however powerful, rarely start a revolution on their own. They need a catalyst, a crisis that exposes the weaknesses of the old system so glaringly that they can no longer be ignored. In France's case, that catalyst was money, or rather the catastrophic lack thereof. While the philosophes questioned the theoretical legitimacy of the monarchy, a far more practical and urgent problem was brewing in the royal treasury. The kingdom was hurtling toward complete and absolute bankruptcy. This was not a sudden development, but the culmination of a century of reckless spending, costly wars, and a tax system that was, to put it mildly, fundamentally broken. The French monarchy had an expenditure problem of epic proportions, and the bill was finally due. A significant portion of this expenditure, of course, was the staggering cost of maintaining the royal court and the prestige of the monarchy. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a greedy consumer of the national wealth. The endless cycle of balls, banquets, and elaborate court ceremonies, the pensions paid to thousands of favored nobles, and the constant construction and renovation projects all cost a fortune. And at the center of this world of extravagance was Queen Marie Antoinette. The Austrian-born wife of King Louis XVI became, fairly or unfairly, the living symbol of the monarchy's detachment from the suffering of its people. She was young, beautiful, and utterly tone-deaf to the realities of life outside the palace walls. Stories, often greatly exaggerated by libels, circulated about her wasteful lifestyle, her towering powdered hairstyles, her custom-made extravagant gowns, and her charmingly rustic fantasy hamlet, the Hameau de la Reine, built on the grounds of Versailles, where she and her ladies-in-waiting could play at being simple shepherdesses with perfumed sheep. Her supposed statement, upon hearing the peasants had no bread, "Let them eat cake," is almost certainly a myth, but the fact that people believed it speaks volumes about her reputation. The historical debate over her role is complex. She was a foreigner caught in a political snake pit, and much of the criticism was fueled by misogyny and xenophobia. Nevertheless, her spending was undeniably lavish and served as an easy, visible target for the public's rising anger. However, the Queen's dress budget, vast as it was a mere drop in the bucket compared to the truly ruinous expenditure: war. For decades, France had been dragged into a series of global conflicts, mostly against its great rival, Great Britain. The 7 Years' War, ending in 1763, was an especially costly and humiliating defeat for France, resulting in the loss of its colonies in North America and India. Then, in an attempt to restore its prestige and strike a blow against the British, France made a fateful decision: intervene on the side of the colonists in the American War of Independence. French financial and military support was crucial to the American victory. The French fleet blockaded the British at Yorktown, and French gold paid for American supplies. While it was a satisfying geopolitical victory, it was a Pyrrhic one. The cost of the war was astronomical, adding over $1 billion to a national debt that was already at crisis level. The irony was bitter. France's absolute monarchy had funded a revolution fought in the name of liberty and republican ideals, and in doing so, signed its own financial death warrant. This mountain of debt might have been manageable if the kingdom had a fair and efficient way of raising money, but it did not. The French tax system was a chaotic, unjust, and hopelessly outdated mess.
As we know, the two wealthiest estates in the kingdom, the clergy and the nobility, were largely exempt from the most important direct tax, the tille. The vast wealth tied up in church lands and aristocratic estates remained virtually untouched. This meant the burden of taxation fell disproportionately on the third estate, and hardest of all, on the poorest of the poor, the peasantry. The collection methods were equally outrageous. The government did not collect taxes directly, but outsourced the job to a private consortium of financiers known as the Farmers General, or Fermiers Généraux. These tax farmers paid the state a lump sum for the right to collect taxes in a specific region, and then kept everything they collected over that amount. This created a perverse incentive to squeeze taxpayers as mercilessly as possible, and the tax collectors were universally despised figures. As the 1780s progressed, the situation became desperate. Over half of the government's entire annual revenue was spent just on paying the interest on the national debt. The kingdom was essentially operating on a massive deficit year after year, borrowing new money simply to pay off its old creditors. King Louis XVI, a well-meaning but tragically indecisive and unremarkable man, was ill-equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude. He was a devoted husband and father who was more comfortable tinkering with locks or going hunting than dealing with the complex and brutal world of state finance. He appointed a series of finance ministers who all came to the same logical yet politically explosive conclusion. The only way to solve the crisis was to reform the tax system and force the privileged first and second estates to pay their fair share. Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, one such minister, introduced a radical package of reforms that included a new land tax to be paid by all landowners, regardless of their social status. It was a sensible, modern, and absolutely necessary proposal, and the privileged estates met it with furious resistance. They viewed it not as a necessary sacrifice for the good of the nation, but as a direct assault on their ancient rights and their very identity. Using their influence in the high courts called the Parlement, they blocked the royal reforms at every turn, selfishly guarding their privileges, even as the state itself was sinking.
The last chance, the Estates General. The great historical enigma is whether a stronger king could have forced these reforms through. Louis XVI, however, wavered. Faced with this aristocratic stubbornness and a completely empty treasury, he was finally forced to play his last card, a move his ancestors had avoided for 175 years. He agreed to convene the Estates General, the old medieval representative assembly of the three estates, to meet in the spring of 1789 to approve his new taxes. He hoped this would be a way to bypass the recalcitrant nobles. He had no idea that he wasn't just opening a meeting, he was opening a Pandora's box. The announcement that the king was calling the Estates General sparked a wave of excitement and anticipation across France. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the people were invited to participate, albeit indirectly, in the great affairs of the nation. It felt like the dawn of a new era, a moment of profound hope. The winter and spring preceding the May 1789 assembly were filled with a flurry of political activity unlike anything the country had ever seen. Elections were held in every corner of the kingdom to choose the deputies who would represent each of the 3 estates. This process was radicalizing in itself. For millions of French people, it was their first taste of politics. In towns and villages, people gathered to discuss the issues of the day and select the individuals they would entrust with their hopes and grievances. As part of this process, each electoral district was tasked with compiling a list of its complaints and suggestions for reform, known as the Cahiers de Doléances, or grievance books. These documents provide an extraordinary snapshot of France on the eve of the Revolution, a collective outpouring of centuries of frustration. Thousands of these lists survive, and they are a treasure trove for the historian.
The cahiers of the first and second estates were, predictably, primarily concerned with protecting their own privileges. They talked about the need for financial reform, yes, but they were adamant that their ancient rights and tax exemptions must be preserved, viewing them as a necessary bulwark against royal tyranny. The cahiers of the Third Estate, however, tell a very different story. They paint a vivid picture of a society groaning under the weight of an unjust system. Peasants wrote of the hated salt tax, the crushing burden of feudal dues, and the unfairness of having their crops trampled by noble hunting parties. The bourgeoisie wrote enthusiastically about the need for a written constitution, for equality before the law, and for careers in government and the military to be open to men of talent, not just men of noble birth. What is remarkable about these grievances is what they do not say. Reading them, one is struck by the almost universal tone of loyalty and affection toward the king. For the most part, they were not calling for a republic or the overthrow of the monarchy. They appealed to Louis XVI as a benevolent father who they believed was simply misled by corrupt ministers and selfish aristocrats. There was a strong and ultimately naive belief that the king and the Third Estate were natural allies against the entrenched power of the privileged estates. This faith in the monarch as a potential savior was a powerful force, but it would not survive the political battles about to begin. The central burning issue that dominated all discussion was a seemingly dry procedural one, yet it held the key to the entire future of France. How would the Estates General vote? By tradition, the assembly voted by estate. This meant that each of the three estates would deliberate and vote as a single block. The first estate would get one vote, the second estate would get one vote, and the third estate would get one vote. This was a system designed for a medieval world, and its outcome was predetermined. The clergy and the nobility, the two privileged estates, would naturally vote together to protect their interests, easily outvoting the Third Estate 2-1. Any meaningful reform, especially tax reform, would be doomed. The Third Estate deputies, who were mostly educated lawyers and members of the bourgeoisie, immediately recognized this. They arrived at Versailles armed with a powerful new sense of their own importance. They knew they represented not just an estate, but the overwhelming majority of the nation itself. They began to argue for a different system, voting by head. In this system, each individual deputy would receive one vote. In a crucial early concession, the king had agreed that the Third Estate could elect twice as many deputies as the other two estates, about 600 for them, versus 300 for the clergy and 300 for the nobility. This doubling of the third meant that if they could force voting by head, they would have the numerical majority.
The vote and the nation. Abbé Sieyès. They could hope to peel away reform-minded parish priests from the First Estate and a few liberal nobles from the Second, giving them the power to pass a radical agenda of change. In the early stages, the entire revolution hinged on this single issue. The strongest and most articulate argument for the supremacy of the Third Estate came from a pamphlet written by a clergyman, Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. His work, titled What is the Third Estate, or Qu'est-ce que le tiers état, was a captivating piece of political rhetoric that swept the nation. It began with three simple but devastating questions and answers. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been heretofore in the political order? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something. Sieyès argued that the Third Estate was not merely one estate among three, but the complete nation itself. The nobility, he argued, were a parasitic tumor, a foreign body that contributed nothing to the nation's life and only drained its resources. The idea of the nation was taking root, a concept of a unified people bound by common laws and interests, and it was a direct challenge to the old world of corporate privileges.
When the deputies finally assembled at Versailles on May 5, 1789, the scene was set for a dramatic confrontation. The opening ceremony itself was a calculated display of the old hierarchies, designed to put the Third Estate in its place. The deputies of the First and Second Estates were commanded to wear magnificent costumes of silk and lace, with feathered hats and swords. The deputies of the Third Estate, in contrast, were ordered to wear simple, somber black suits, the garb of lower functionaries. This was a deliberate public humiliation, and it spectacularly backfired, only uniting them and deepening their sense of collective grievance. After the king gave a short, uninspiring speech about the need to fix the nation's finances, and his ministers gave no clear direction on the critical voting issue, the battle lines were drawn. The Third Estate refused to conduct any business, even the simple task of verifying their credentials, until the other two estates agreed to meet with them as a single body and vote by head. For 6 long, tense weeks, a political stalemate ensued. The Third Estate held firm, engaging in a brilliant strategy of passive resistance. They knew the nation was watching and were determined to show that they, and they alone, were the true representatives of the French people. The king procrastinated, the nobility fumed, and the quiet, stubborn men in black waited.
The Tennis Court Oath, the National Assembly. After 6 weeks of paralyzing stalemate, the Third Estate deputies decided the time for waiting was over. There were persistent rumors circulating in Versailles that the king, spurred on by his more conservative noble advisors and his wife, was planning to dissolve the Estates General and rule by decree. The men in black realized that if they didn't act decisively, their historic opportunity would be lost. On June 17, 1789, inspired by the passionate arguments of Abbé Sieyès, they took a momentous and audacious step. They unilaterally declared themselves the National Assembly, Assemblée Nationale. This was a revolutionary act of the deepest significance. With this simple declaration, they ceased to be merely one of 3 estates in a medieval assembly. They proclaimed themselves the sole legitimate representative body of the entire French nation. They asserted that because they represented 97% of the population, they were the nation. The other 2 estates were welcome to join them, not as privileged orders, but as fellow citizens. This was a direct seizure of sovereignty from the king. It was a clear statement that the ultimate power to make laws now resided with the elected representatives of the people. The assembly was led by a constellation of formidable figures. Alongside the intellectual architect Sieyès was the towering and charismatic figure of Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau. Mirabeau was a fascinating and contradictory man. He was a nobleman by birth, but was elected as a deputy for the Third Estate. A brilliant orator with a dubious private life and a face scarred by smallpox, he possessed a booming voice and a magnetic presence that could hold an audience captive. He was a moderate who passionately believed in the necessity of a constitutional monarchy, a system that balanced the king's power with the rights of the nation. And his powerful speeches gave voice and courage to the assembly's ambitions. The king and his court were thrown into confusion by this bold move. Louis XVI, torn between the desire for reform and a deep-seated belief in his own absolute power, was, as usual, indecisive. His harder-line advisors, including his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, urged him to use force to suppress this nascent rebellion. They planned a séance royale, a royal session, where the king would appear before all 3 estates and dictate his will, effectively annulling the assembly's declarations. In preparation for this royal session, scheduled for June 23rd, the king ordered the main meeting hall of the Third Estate, the Salle des Menus Plaisirs, to be shut down and locked, allegedly for renovations.
On the morning of June 20th, a cloudy and rainy day, the deputies of the new National Assembly arrived at their hall to find the doors barricaded and guarded by royal soldiers. Panic began. They viewed this as the first step toward a royal coup, a prelude to their arrest and dissolution. They gathered outside, a crowd of anxious men in black. Their revolutionary project was on the verge of collapse before it had truly begun. But instead of dispersing, their fear quickly turned to defiance. It was one of their members, a doctor named Joseph Ignace Guillotin, whose name would later be ironically attached to a much darker revolutionary invention, who suggested finding an alternative meeting place. He knew of a large vaulted building nearby, an indoor tennis court, the Jeu de Paume. And so the deputies of the Third Estate walked in a solemn procession through the wet streets of Versailles to the tennis court. It was a stark and unfurnished space, far removed from the gilded halls of the palace. There was no throne, no ceremonial furniture, only a large, empty room with bare walls and a high ceiling. This humble setting only added to the drama and seriousness of the moment. Standing in the middle of the court, surrounded by deputies who clustered around him on benches and tables brought in from outside, the astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the president of the assembly, climbed onto an improvised platform. He read a solemn oath. The deputies swore never to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances demand until the constitution of the kingdom is established and secured upon solid foundations. One by one, the deputies stepped forward to sign the oath. Their faces expressed a mixture of fear, excitement, and grim determination. A loud roar of "Long live the King" and "Long live the nation" echoed through the hall, for they still believed they were acting in the king's true interests. Only one deputy refused to sign. This event was immortalized in the famous, dramatic, and somewhat romanticized painting by Jacques-Louis David, which depicts the deputies with their arms extended toward Bailly, united in a single powerful gesture of revolutionary will, with the drafts of change blowing through the open windows. The historical debate surrounding the oath is focused on its spontaneity. Was it a spontaneous act of defiance or a carefully calculated element of political theater? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. The Assembly's leaders certainly knew they needed a powerful unifying gesture to cement their position. But the raw emotions and genuine fear of that morning were undoubtedly real. The tennis court oath was the first great act of defiance of the revolution. It was a clear and public statement that the representatives of the people would not be intimidated or silenced. When the king finally held his royal session 3 days later and ordered the estates to disperse and reassemble in their old chambers, Mirabeau gave the monarchy its most famous rebuke. When the royal master of ceremonies repeated the king's order to disperse, Mirabeau thundered, "Go tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and we shall not leave except by the force of bayonets." Faced with this unwavering resolve, the king retreated. He eventually gave in and ordered the clergy and the nobility to join the National Assembly. It was a stunning victory for the Third Estate. They had defied an absolute monarch and won. They established themselves as the new center of power in France, and their great work of writing a constitution could now begin. But the king and his court did not truly accept defeat, and outside the refined world of Versailles, another, more volatile force was about to enter the stage.
The powder keg, hunger and soldiers. The political victories at Versailles were thrilling, but they were happening in a vacuum. While the deputies of the National Assembly debated constitutional theory, the city of Paris, just a dozen miles away, was boiling with a much more primal mixture of hunger and fear. The spring and summer of 1789 were a time of acute economic crisis. The previous year's harvest had been disastrous, leading to a severe grain shortage.
As a result, the price of bread, the staple food that made up over half the diet of an ordinary worker, skyrocketed. The average Parisian laborer was spending up to 80% of his income just to feed his family, and often bread could not be had at any price. This desperation fueled a palpable sense of anger and injustice, a feeling that the people were starving while the aristocrats and the king feasted at Versailles. The bakery became the new political scene, a place of rumor, grievance, and a growing certainty that the famine was not an act of God, but a deliberate conspiracy of the nobility to starve the people into submission. This hunger was now exacerbated by fear. King Louis XVI had publicly accepted the National Assembly, but his actions spoke otherwise. In late June and early July, he began secretly summoning thousands of troops, mostly reliable foreign mercenaries like Swiss and German regiments, into the Paris region. By early July, the capital was surrounded by a ring of approximately 20,000 soldiers. The official reason was maintaining order, but no one in Paris believed this. They saw the troops for what they were, a threat. The king seemed to be preparing to launch his counter-revolution, to use military force to dissolve the assembly and crush the hopes of the Third Estate. The city was a powder keg, and the air was crackling with the nervous energy of an impending storm. Political orators took to the streets, holding impromptu speeches in the squares and gardens, most famously at the Palais Royal, where a fiery young journalist named Camille Desmoulins called the people to arms. The final spark fell on July 11th. King Louis, finally yielding to the hardline faction at court, dismissed and exiled his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker. Necker was a Swiss Protestant, and although his actual abilities as a financier were questionable, the public considered him their man in government, the only minister who sincerely tried to solve the crisis and who was sympathetic to the cause of the Third Estate. His dismissal was interpreted as a declaration of war, a clear sign that the royalist coup was about to begin. When news of Necker's firing reached Paris on July 12th, the city exploded. Mobs poured into the streets, carrying wax busts of Necker salvaged from a local museum. They clashed with royal cavalry units, and the city descended into a state close to anarchy. Over the next 2 days, the people of Paris began to arm themselves. They raided gun shops and sword makers' workshops. In a crucial moment, they stormed the military hospital at the Hôtel des Invalides, the home for invalids, seizing tens of thousands of muskets. They now had the weapons, but they lacked one vital element to make them work: gunpowder, and they knew exactly where to find it. Towering over the eastern part of the city stood the Bastille, a massive, grim stone fortress with 8 imposing towers. The Bastille had been built in the Middle Ages to defend the city, but by the 18th century it had become a notorious state prison. In reality, its significance was mostly symbolic. It was an expensive and outdated fortress that the government was already considering demolishing. And by 1789, it held only 7 prisoners, 4 counterfeiters, 2 mentally ill men, and 1 wayward aristocrat. But in the public consciousness, the Bastille was the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny and arbitrariness. It was the place where the king could endlessly imprison his enemies without trial, based on a simple secret order known as a lettre de cachet. To the people of Paris, it represented everything they hated about the Ancien Regime, and most importantly on this day, its dungeons held a vast store of gunpowder. On the morning of July 14th, a huge crowd, an explosive mix of shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers from the working-class quarter of Saint-Antoine, gathered outside the fortress, demanding that its governor, the Marquis de Launay, surrender the gunpowder and remove the cannons menacingly aimed at the city streets. De Launay refused. Negotiations dragged on for hours. The mood grew darker, more impatient. Somewhere in the early afternoon, a few men managed to climb the walls and lower one of the drawbridges. The crowd surged into the outer courtyard, and the garrison of Swiss guards and elderly French veterans opened fire. The Battle of the Bastille had begun. For 4 hours, a chaotic and bloody siege raged. The mob, armed with muskets from the Invalides, fired from the roofs of surrounding buildings, while the defenders fired cannon and musket fire from the towers. The attackers were disorganized but relentless. The crucial turning point came when a contingent of mutinous royal soldiers, the French Guards, joined the crowd, bringing with them professional military expertise and, most importantly, several cannon. They aimed their artillery directly at the main gate. The governor, Delaunay, seeing his position was hopeless, finally surrendered. The crowd surged into the fortress, freeing the handful of bewildered prisoners and seizing the gunpowder. The governor was taken prisoner and marched towards the city hall. But along the way, he was overcome by the vengeful mob, killed, and his head was sawed off with a pocket knife, put on a pike, and triumphantly paraded through the streets. The fall of the Bastille was a stunning victory. It was a military triumph, but more than that, it was a symbolic earthquake. The people of Paris, through their own courage and violence, had overwhelmed a symbol of royal authority that had stood for centuries. When the king, returning from a hunting trip, was told of the day's events, he asked his advisor, "Is it a revolt?" The famous reply followed, "No, sire, it is not a revolt. It is a revolution." The violence had saved the National Assembly, as the king, shaken by the events, withdrew his troops from Paris and reinstated Necker. The revolution was no longer merely a legal debate among educated men in Versailles. It was now a popular movement, baptized in blood, and its center of gravity had decisively shifted to the streets of Paris.
The Great Fear, the attack on feudalism. The fall of the Bastille was a Parisian drama, but news of it spread across France like a wildfire, carried by breathless couriers and reprinted in hastily issued pamphlets. In the provincial towns and cities, the authority of the king, already weakened, seemed to completely evaporate. Local officials were overthrown, and new municipal councils and citizen militias, modeled on the new National Guard in Paris, were formed. But in the vast French countryside, where the majority of the population lived, the news from the capital mixed with long-standing grievances and a powerful cocktail of rumors to create a bizarre and terrifying phenomenon that became known as the Great Fear, La Grande Peur. For several weeks in late July and early August 1789, a wave of collective hysteria and peasant violence swept across large swaths of the nation. The roots of the Great Fear lay in the same economic desperation that paralyzed Paris. The peasants were hungry, suffering from the same bread shortages, and they were deeply suspicious of the nobility, whom they blamed for their woes. A powerful conspiracy theory took hold and spread with astonishing speed. The aristocrats, furious at the Third Estate's victory in Versailles, were allegedly taking revenge by hiring armies of brigands and vagrants to roam the countryside, burning the crops and destroying the harvests in the field to starve the people into submission. There was no evidence for this aristocratic plot, but in the charged and uncertain atmosphere of that summer, it felt entirely plausible. Every dust cloud on the horizon, every unfamiliar face in the village, every strange light at night, all were interpreted as proof that the brigands were coming. The fear was contagious, and it triggered a massive defensive mobilization. Peasants armed themselves with whatever they could find, pitchforks, hunting guns, farming scythes, and stood guard in their villages, waiting for an enemy who never arrived. This defensive panic soon turned into an offensive rebellion. The peasants, now armed and organized, realized that the real source of their misery was not some phantom army of brigands, but the very real system of feudalism that had oppressed their families for centuries. If the aristocrats were plotting against them, they reasoned, the time had come to strike back at the symbols of aristocratic power.
Across the country, bands of peasants attacked the local chateau, the large manor houses of the nobility. Their primary target was not necessarily to harm the lord himself, many of whom had already fled, but to destroy the legal basis of his power. They stormed the archives and cellars of the castles, seeking out the ancient feudal charters, the dusty parchments that recorded all the dues and obligations the peasants owed their masters. These documents, which itemized everything from annual grain payments to the hated requirement to work the lord's land, were the legal chains of their servitude. In massive bonfires in the castle courtyards, the peasants burned these records, an act of liberation that was both practical and deeply symbolic. The violence was sporadic. In some cases, the lords and their families were treated with a degree of respect. In others, the chateaux were looted and burned to the ground, and particularly hated nobles or their agents were occasionally attacked and killed. But the core thrust of the movement was the complete dismantling of the feudal system from the bottom up. Peasants refused to pay their dues. They reclaimed common lands that had been enclosed by the aristocracy, and hunted freely in forests that had once been the exclusive preserve of the nobility. This was a revolution that was far more radical and socially profound than the legal debates happening in the National Assembly. It was a direct, violent, and largely successful peasant war against the remnants of medieval France.
The night of August 4, the collapse of the old world. News of this chaos in the countryside soon reached the deputies in Versailles, and it filled them with alarm. The members of the Assembly, who were primarily bourgeois property owners, were staunch defenders of law and order. They were terrified by the prospect of this popular anarchy and knew they had to do something to pacify the peasantry and restore control. On the night of August 4, they convened a special session to discuss the crisis. What followed was one of the most remarkable and dramatic sessions in the history of the revolution. A liberal nobleman, the Vicomte de Noailles, took the floor and made an astonishing proposal. He argued that the only way to quiet the provinces was for the nobility to voluntarily renounce their feudal privileges. What started as a pragmatic political maneuver quickly escalated into a patriotic frenzy of self-sacrifice. One after another, the kingdom's greatest nobles, dukes, and marquises, whose families had held their privileges for centuries, stood up and in emotional speeches renounced their ancient rights. The Duc de Guion, one of the wealthiest landowners in France, declared his support for legal and tax equality. The clergy followed suit, giving up their right to collect the tithe. Soon, representatives of provinces and towns were surrendering their own special historical privileges, all in the name of creating a unified French nation. In a single, feverish, all-night session, fueled by a strange mix of fear, idealism, and patriotic fervor, the Assembly systematically dismantled the entire legal and social structure of the Ancien Régime. They abolished feudal dues, the lord's right to hunt, the sale of public offices, and tax exemptions. By the time the sun rose on the morning of August 5th, the old order of corporate privileges was dead. The Assembly later codified these resolutions into a series of decrees, famously declaring that the National Assembly totally abolishes the feudal system. The great fear in the countryside had forced the hand of the politicians in Versailles, accelerating the pace of the revolution and transforming the struggle for a constitution into a profound social transformation. Having swept away the wreckage of the old feudal world in the single feverish night of August 4, the National Assembly now faced the deeper and more complex task of laying the philosophical cornerstone for the new France they intended to build. Before they could write a detailed constitution, they needed to agree on a set of fundamental principles, a statement of intent that would define the very meaning of their revolution. The result was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, a short,
elegant, and monumentally important document that would become one of the most influential political texts in human history. Issued in late August 1789, it was the Revolution's birth certificate, a lyrical and powerful expression of the Enlightenment ideals that had been brewing beneath the surface of French society for decades. The creation of the Declaration was a deeply intellectual process, a series of intense debates among the deputies about the very nature of liberty, law, and government. The assembly was filled with men who were steeped in the works of the philosophes, the ideas of Montesquieu, the skepticism of Voltaire, and above all, the powerful concepts of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau echoed throughout every article. The influence of the recent American Revolution was also immense. Thomas Jefferson was serving as the American ambassador to France at the time, and his Paris residence became an unofficial salon for many key figures of the Assembly. One of the Declaration's leading proponents, the Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of the American War and a close friend of Jefferson, even circulated his own draft, which he had shown to his American mentor for advice.
The Declaration of Rights, Triumph and Limitations. Thus, the French Declaration was the product of this transatlantic conversation, a distillation of the most advanced political thought of its time. The document opens with a majestic and soaring preamble, stating that the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of public calamities and the corruption of governments. To prevent this, it seeks to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man. The very first of these propositions was a revolution in itself. It placed the source of political legitimacy not in the will of God or the tradition of a dynasty, but in the inherent rights of individual human beings. The following 17 articles build upon this foundation, creating a blueprint for a new kind of society. The first and most famous article states, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." This single sentence was a dagger to the heart of the Ancien Regime, with its tangled pyramid of legal privileges and hereditary status. It was a formal rejection of the idea that a person's value or opportunities should be determined by the accident of their birth. The Declaration goes on to define these natural rights as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. This was a clear statement that the primary purpose of any government was not to glorify the king or enforce religious dogma, but to protect the lives and freedoms of its individual citizens. Many articles address the nature of law and justice. The Declaration asserts that all citizens are equal before the law and that no one can be arrested or punished except according to established legal procedures, and that every person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. This was a direct assault on the arbitrary justice of the old monarchy, with its secret lettres de cachet and its cruel methods of interrogation. It enshrined the principle of popular sovereignty, explicitly stating in Article 3 that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. The law, it continues, must be the expression of the general will, and all citizens have the right to participate in its formation, either personally or through their representatives. The king was no longer the source of law. The nation was. The Declaration also championed the great freedoms of the Enlightenment: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. It called for a fair tax system, which must be paid by all citizens in proportion to their means, a direct response to the unjust tax system that had brought the monarchy to its knees. And finally, it established the principle of public accountability, stating that society has the right to require of every public agent an accounting of his administration.
Essentially, it was a complete theoretical dismantling of the principles of absolute monarchy and a blueprint for a liberal constitutional state. Yet, for all its universalist rhetoric, the Declaration was a document of its time and contained significant and troubling limitations. The most glaring of these was its understanding of man and citizen. The deputies who wrote these words, for all their radicalism, were men of the 18th century, and they implicitly understood man to mean propertied white adult males. The issue of slavery in the French colonies was deliberately skirted. The rights of religious minorities, like Protestants and Jews, were debated and only granted later and with some reluctance. And most significantly, the rights of women were completely ignored. This omission was not gone unchallenged. In 1791, the brilliant and brave writer and political activist Olympe de Gouges published a direct retort, The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, Déclaration des droits de la femme et de la citoyenne. In it, she cleverly rewrote the original declaration article by article to include women. Her version began with the electrifying statement, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." She argued that if women had the right to be executed on the guillotine, they must also have the right to speak publicly and participate in government. Her declaration was a groundbreaking piece of feminist thought, but it was largely rejected at the time. De Gouges herself would later be executed during the Reign of Terror, a tragic victim of the revolution's failure to live up to its own highest ideals. This historical debate about the Declaration's universality continues to this day. Was it a tragically flawed document, a product of the prejudices of its time? Or was its true power in the universal principles it unleashed, which could then be used by marginalized groups, from women to colonial subjects, to demand the very rights its authors initially denied them? Whatever its limitations, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was a turning point. It transformed the French Revolution from a mere financial crisis into a universal struggle for human liberty, and its words would echo through every subsequent struggle for freedom around the world.
The Women's March on Versailles, October 1789. The Declaration of Rights was a beautiful and inspiring statement of principle, but its high words could not fill an empty stomach. As the autumn of 1789 began, the city of Paris was again in the grip of a severe bread shortage. The harvest had been brought in, but grain was not flowing into the capital in sufficient quantity. Again, long lines formed outside bakeries, and the mood in the working-class districts turned grim and angry. Political suspicions were also running high. The king had still not formally approved the August decrees, which abolished feudalism, nor had he given his royal assent to the Declaration of Rights. To the people of Paris, his hesitation looked like stubborn defiance, a sign that he was still listening to the hardline aristocrats at court who were plotting a counter-revolution. Rumors began to circulate that the king was planning to flee, perhaps to the royalist stronghold of Metz in the east, where he could gather loyal troops and return to crush the National Assembly. This fear was sharply amplified by reports of a banquet held at the Palace of Versailles on October 1st. At this feast for the officers of the newly arrived Flanders Regiment, the king's personal guard, the mood apparently became openly royalist. In a drunken frenzy, the officers supposedly threw the new revolutionary cockade, the red, white, and blue emblem of the new France, to the floor and trampled it, replacing it with the white cockade of the Bourbon monarchy and the black cockade of the Queen. When news of this desecration of a revolutionary symbol reached Paris, it was viewed as an unbearable insult, the final proof of the court's treachery. The radical press seized on the story, painting a picture of a decadent court feasting and plotting against the nation while the common people starved. The breaking point came on the morning of October 5th. It was a cold, rainy Monday.
The women of the central markets of Paris, the formidable poissardes, fishwives, known for their sharp tongues and physical strength, finally snapped. They began gathering at the market, their anger over the price of bread escalating into a full-scale protest. One young woman reportedly seized a drum and began marching through the streets. Her drumbeat served as a summons. Soon thousands of women joined her, armed with kitchen knives, rolling pins, and even a few old cannons dragged from the city hall. Their initial demand was simple: bread, but it quickly merged with the political outrage over the events at Versailles. They began shouting for the king to come to Paris, believing that if he were in the city, among his people, he would not be so easily manipulated by the Austrian woman, their name for the queen, and the corrupt court. The crowd, now numbering in the thousands, first stormed the Hôtel de Ville, City Hall, demanding bread and arms. Then they made an extraordinary decision. They would march to Versailles themselves, a 12-mile trek through mud and rain, to take their grievances directly to the king and the National Assembly. As they began their long, arduous journey, thousands of others joined them, including men and members of the National Guard, who were swept up by the momentum of the moment. The Marquis de Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, was initially reluctant to follow, but he was eventually forced by his own men to lead a more organized contingent of guardsmen to Versailles, ostensibly to maintain order, but also to ensure the demonstrators' demands were heard.
The captivity of the king, the end of Versailles. The scene at Versailles that afternoon was one of total chaos. A massive, mud-splattered crowd of angry Parisian women arrived at the palace gates. Their cries for bread echoed across the parade grounds. A delegation of women was admitted to the National Assembly Hall, where they burst onto the floor, surrounding the frightened deputies and demanding they take action to lower the price of bread. The Assembly, overwhelmed, quickly promised to do what they could and sent a deputation, led by its president and including several market women, to see the king. Louis XVI, who had been hunting when the march began, met with the women and, with his customary gentleness, promised to order all the grain in Versailles to be sent to Paris. This seemed to satisfy some of the demonstrators, but the majority were not so easily pacified. Their central demand remained: the king must return with them to Paris. A restless and tense standoff followed that night. Lafayette and his National Guardsmen finally arrived and took positions to protect the palace. But the huge crowd remained in the courtyards, their mood still volatile. The tragic climax came in the pre-dawn hours of October 6th. A small group of protesters looking for another way into the palace found an unlocked gate and surged inside. They rushed through the corridors, their main target being the Queen's apartments. Cries demanded her death. Marie Antoinette, woken just in time by her ladies-in-waiting, was forced to flee in terror through a secret passage to the king's chambers, just moments before the mob burst into her bedroom and hacked at bed with pikes. The palace guards were overwhelmed. Several were killed, and their heads were severed and paraded on pikes. To quell the violence, the king, on Lafayette's advice, agreed to appear on the balcony before the massive, menacing crowd. He was met with cries of "Long live the king," but the cheers soon changed to Paris, to Paris." In a moment of extraordinary personal courage, Marie Antoinette, the object of so much of the crowd's hatred, then stepped out onto the balcony herself, flanked by her small children. The crowd fell silent for a moment, some raising their muskets, before Lafayette knelt and kissed her hand, a gesture of respect that seemed to defuse the immediate threat. But the will of the crowd was unwavering. The king had no choice but to comply. Later that day, a strange and unprecedented procession left Versailles. At its head marched the National Guardsmen carrying pikes topped with the heads of the slain palace guards and wagons laden with flour from the palace stores.
Then followed the royal carriage, carrying the king, the queen, and their son, followed by the deputies of the National Assembly. They were surrounded by a vast, jubilant crowd of Parisian women who chanted they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy back to Paris. The women's march had succeeded. The king's power was broken. He was now, in essence, a prisoner of his own people. His authority was subject to the will of the Parisian mob. The move to the Tuileries Palace in the heart of the capital marked the definitive end of the old court world of Versailles and the beginning of a new, more radical, and far more dangerous phase of the revolution. The transatlantic ideal, the rights of man. Thus, the French Declaration was the product of this transatlantic conversation, a distillation of the most advanced political thought of its time. The document opens with a majestic and soaring preamble, stating that the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of public calamities and the corruption of governments. To prevent this, it aims to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man. The very first of these propositions was a revolution in itself. It placed the source of political legitimacy not in the will of God or the tradition of a dynasty, but in the inherent rights of individual human beings. The subsequent 17 articles build upon this foundation, creating a blueprint for a new kind of society. The first and most famous article states, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." This single sentence was a dagger to the heart of the Ancien Régime, with its complex pyramid of legal privileges and inherited status. It was a formal rejection of the idea that a person's worth or opportunities should be determined by the accident of their birth. The Declaration goes on to define these natural rights as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. This was a clear statement that the primary purpose of any government was not to glorify the king or enforce religious dogma, but to protect the lives and freedoms of its individual citizens. Many articles dealt with the nature of law and justice. The Declaration asserted that all citizens are equal before the law, that no one can be arrested or punished except according to established legal procedures, and that every person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. This was a direct assault on the arbitrary justice of the old monarchy. It enshrined the principle of popular sovereignty, explicitly stating in Article 3 that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. The law, it continues, must be the expression of the general will, and all citizens have the right to participate in its formation. The king was no longer the source of law. The nation was. The Declaration also championed the great freedoms of the Enlightenment: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. It called for a fair system of taxation, paid by all citizens proportionally to their means. And finally, it established the principle of public accountability, stating that society has the right to demand an account of his administration from every public agent. Yet, for all its universalist rhetoric, the Declaration was a document of its time and contained significant and troubling limitations. The most glaring of these was its understanding of man and citizen. The deputies who wrote these words implicitly understood man to mean propertied, white, adult males. The issue of slavery in the colonies was deliberately bypassed. The rights of women were entirely ignored. This omission did not go unanswered. In 1791, the brilliant and courageous activist Olympe de Gouges published a direct response. the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. In it, she rewrote the original declaration article by article to include women. Her version opened with the electrifying statement, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." She argued that if women had the right to be executed on the guillotine, they must also have the right to speak publicly and participate in government. Her declaration was a groundbreaking piece of feminist thought, but it was largely rejected at the time. De Gaulle herself would later be executed during the Reign of Terror, a tragic casualty of the revolution's failure to live up to its own highest ideals. This historical debate over the Declaration's universality continues to this day. Was it a tragically flawed document? Or was its true power in the universal principles it unleashed, which could then be used by marginalized groups to demand the very rights its authors initially denied them? Whatever its limitations, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was a turning point. It transformed the French Revolution from a mere financial crisis into a universal struggle for human liberty. The crisis of confidence. The flight to Varennes. The Declaration of Rights was a beautiful and inspiring statement, but its high words could not fill an empty stomach. By the autumn of 1789, the city of Paris was again in the grip of a severe bread shortage. Political suspicion was also running high. The king had still not formally approved the August decrees, nor given his royal assent to the Declaration of Rights. To the people of Paris, his hesitation looked like stubborn defiance, a sign that he was still listening to the hard-line aristocrats. This fear was sharply amplified by reports of a banquet held at the Palace of Versailles on October 1. In a drunken frenzy, officers supposedly trampled the revolutionary cockade and replaced it with the royal one. When news of this desecration reached Paris, it was viewed as an intolerable insult, the final proof of the court's betrayal. King Louis XVI was a man of deep faith, and the civil constitution of the clergy was a wound to his conscience. He had been raised to believe he was France's most Christian king, the divinely appointed protector of the Catholic faith. Now the Assembly was asking him to approve a law that had been condemned by the Pope, and which he believed placed the souls of his subjects in mortal peril. He felt locked in. For months he had been living in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a gilded cage where his every move was watched by the National Guard and the suspicious eyes of the Parisian public. He was no longer the master of his kingdom, but the unwilling stamp for the revolution. Urged on by Queen Marie Antoinette, who was always more perceptive and disdainful of the revolution than her hesitant husband, Louis made a fateful decision: to escape. The plan was not to leave France, but to break out of the radical cauldron of Paris and travel to the eastern frontier, to the town of Montmédy. There, he could rally loyal army units under the command of the royalist General Bouillet. From this position of strength, he believed he could renegotiate the terms of the Constitution, roll back the Assembly's most radical excesses, especially its religious policies, and restore some of his lost power. It was a desperate gamble, a plan that required meticulous secrecy and flawless execution. It would have neither. The escape was scheduled for the night of June 21, 1791. The royal family, the king, queen, their 2 children, and the king's sister, were to sneak out of the heavily guarded Tuileries Palace in disguise. The king was dressed as a valet, the young Dauphin as a girl, and the queen as a Russian governess. Their breakout from the highly guarded palace was a small miracle in itself, a tense, almost farcical series of near misses and misalignments in the darkened courtyards. Finally, they managed to board a large, conspicuous, and slow-moving custom-made carriage, a berline, that was waiting for them on the outskirts of Paris. From the very beginning, the plan was marred by a series of small but critical errors. The departure was delayed by several hours, meaning the carefully timed relays of loyal soldiers who were meant to meet them along the way would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the heavy Berlin rumbled eastward through the night and into the next day, the king, who had been locked away for so long, seemed to relax. He was confident, even cheerful, convinced he had outsmarted his jailers. But his famous face was his undoing. Though dressed as a servant, he was unused to the role and repeatedly poked his head out the window to view the passing countryside. The whole enterprise had a fatal air of aristocratic amateurism. It was at the town of Saint-Menehould that their luck finally ran out. The local postmaster, a staunch patriot named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, oversaw the changing of the horses for the Berline. He was, not coincidentally, an avid reader of revolutionary pamphlets. He thought he recognized the Queen, and then caught a glimpse of the valet's face. It looked familiar. He recalled having seen it somewhere before. He rushed inside, pulled out a new 50-livre banknote, assignat, and compared the printed portrait to the man in the carriage. It was a perfect match. It was the king. Drouet's mind worked feverishly. He knew he couldn't stop the carriage alone, but he also knew the next planned stop was the small town of Varennes and Argonne. In a heroic burst of patriotism, he and a friend mounted horses and galloped the shortcut through the dark forest, determined to outpace the royal carriage and raise the alarm in Varennes. They arrived just in time. The exhausted royal family reached Varennes to find their military escort confused by the delay, nowhere to be found. While their postilions searched for a fresh relay of horses in the darkened streets, Drouet and his allies quickly awoke the local officials and blocked the bridge out of town with a cart full of furniture. The royal carriage was trapped. The king was questioned by the local prosecutor, a grocer named Sauce. He initially denied his identity, but the evidence was overwhelming. Defeated, he finally admitted, "Yes, I am your king." The flight to Varennes was a political and psychological disaster for the monarchy. The royal family was forced to make the long, humiliating journey back to Paris, surrounded not by loyal subjects, but by a vast crowd of angry and silent citizens. The National Assembly ordered that no one was to cheer or insult the king, but merely observe his capture in stony silence, a clear sign that he was no longer viewed as a beloved father, but as a traitor. The historical significance of this event cannot be overstated. It destroyed what little trust remained between the king and the people. The image of the monarch as a benevolent father was shattered, replaced by that of a weak, duplicitous man who had attempted to abandon his nation in its hour of need. His flight was interpreted as an explicit renunciation of the revolution and the constitution he had sworn to uphold. For the moderate constitutional monarchists, like Lafayette, the situation was a nightmare. Their entire political project was built on the fiction that the king was a willing partner in the revolution. To salvage their constitution, they were forced to push the absurd lie that the king had not fled, but had been kidnapped by evil aristocrats. No one believed it. For the growing number of radicals and Republicans in Paris, Varennes was a gift. It was the final, incontrovertible proof that the monarchy was incompatible with the revolution. The idea of a French republic, once a marginal and extreme notion, now entered the political mainstream.
The military clinch, Pillnitz and Jacques-Pierre Brissot. The king had tried to escape his revolution, but he only succeeded in accelerating its course toward a far more radical and violent destination. The king's failed flight to Varennes sent waves of alarm not only across France, but also through the royal courts of Europe. The monarchs of Austria, Prussia, and Russia watched the events in France with a mix of morbid fascination and increasing dread. The French Revolution was no longer just an internal quarrel. It was a contagious disease of ideas that threatened to infect the entire continent.
The thought of popular sovereignty, of citizens sitting in judgment of their king, was a terrifying prospect for rulers whose authority rested on the unquestioned principles of divine right and hereditary succession. Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II of Austria, was now under enormous pressure from émigré aristocrats to intervene and restore the power of the French crown. In August 1791, the rulers of Austria and Prussia met and issued a joint statement known as the Declaration of Pillnitz. On the surface, it was diplomatic bluster. The two monarchs stated that the situation of the French king was a matter of, quote, common interest to all the sovereigns of Europe, end quote, and threatened vague military action if the royal family were harmed. They conditioned any intervention on the cooperation of all other major European powers, which they knew was highly unlikely. The declaration was a carefully worded attempt to appear threatening without committing to anything. A classic case of diplomatic saber-rattling designed to placate the émigrés. But in the highly paranoid atmosphere of revolutionary France, this subtle threat was not received with calm cynicism. It was interpreted as a direct and imminent declaration of war, a clear sign that the crowned heads of Europe were forming a grand crusade to crush the revolution. The declaration, intended to intimidate, had the exact opposite effect. It inflamed French nationalism and bolstered the arguments of those who felt that France's survival depended on striking first. In October 1791, the National Assembly, having finished its work, was dissolved and replaced by a new body elected under the rules of the new constitution, the Legislative Assembly. This new assembly was made up entirely of new people, as a self-denying ordinance proposed by Deputy Maximilien Robespierre forbade members of the old National Assembly from serving in the new one. The Legislative Assembly was younger, less experienced, and generally more radical than its predecessor. It soon fractured into competing political factions. On the right sat the constitutional monarchists who sought to preserve the settlement of 1791. On the left sat a large and vocal group of deputies who were deeply suspicious of the king and increasingly leaning toward Republican ideas. The most eloquent and influential of these left-wing factions became known as the Girondins, named after the Gironde region from which many of their leaders hailed. They were also known as the Brissotins, after their eloquent and ambitious leader, Jacques-Pierre Brissot. Brissot and the Girondins began to argue passionately for war. They believed that a foreign war would be the ultimate test of the revolution's strength and the king's loyalty. They argued that a conflict against the tyrants of Europe would either force the king to fully embrace the revolution or expose him as a traitor. They were convinced it would unite the nation in a great patriotic crusade, expose the counter-revolutionaries at home, and allow France to export the glorious principles of liberty to the oppressed peoples of Europe. "It is a crusade for universal liberty," Brissot famously proclaimed. It was an intoxicating and deeply idealistic vision, a revolutionary war that would liberate humanity, starting with the overthrow of the Habsburgs in Austria.
The ominous prophecy, Robespierre against war. What is so strange and tragic about this push for war is that it was supported by nearly every political faction, each for their own contradictory reasons. The Girondins wanted war to radicalize the revolution and expose the king. The king and his royalist supporters also secretly wanted war, but for the exact opposite reason. They believed, with great justification, that the unorganized and undisciplined new French army would be quickly and humiliatingly crushed by the professional armies of Austria and Prussia. In the ensuing chaos, the people would turn back to their monarch as the sole source of stability, and the foreign powers would help him restore his absolute authority. It was a cynical and profoundly unpatriotic gamble.
The only group who seemed to want peace was a small, isolated faction of radicals on the far left, whose most influential voice belonged to the quiet, calculating Maximilien Robespierre. In the Jacobin Club, the powerful political club that served as a gathering place for the most radical revolutionaries, Robespierre stood almost alone in arguing against war. In a series of brilliant and prophetic speeches, he warned that war would play directly into the hands of the king and the court. He argued that the real enemies were not the distant armies in Austria, but the counter-revolutionaries at home. The most extravagant idea that can be born in the head of a politician, he warned, is to believe that it is sufficient for a people to enter a foreign territory with arms in their hands to make them adopt their laws and their constitution. No one loves armed missionaries. He predicted that the war would inevitably lead to a military dictatorship, as a victorious general would be tempted to seize power for himself. His warnings were dismissed as the timid grumbling of a man who lacked revolutionary fervor. The patriotic war fever, stoked by the fiery rhetoric of the Girondins, was simply too strong to resist. By the spring of 1792, the calls for war had become deafening. The Girondin-dominated government issued a series of ultimatums to the Austrian emperor, demanding that he disband the émigré armies gathering on the border. When those demands were rejected, the path was clear. On April 20, 1792, King Louis XVI, in a strange and surreal spectacle, appeared before the Legislative Assembly and with a trembling voice proposed a declaration of war against his own brother-in-law, the King of Hungary and Bohemia, the Austrian Emperor. The Assembly, swept up in a wave of patriotic delirium, voted almost unanimously in favor. France was now at war. The conflict they naively believed would be a short and glorious crusade would, in fact, last for nearly a quarter century, engulfing all of Europe. It would swallow the constitutional monarchy, give birth to the Reign of Terror, and ultimately pave the way for the rise of the very military dictator Robespierre so clearly foresaw. The war began as a complete and utter disaster, exactly as the king had hoped and Robespierre had feared. The new French army was a disorganized, undisciplined mess. The officer corps, which was almost entirely aristocratic, had been bled dry by emigration. The volunteer soldiers were enthusiastic, but poorly trained and equipped. When French forces advanced into the Austrian Netherlands, modern Belgium, they met stiff resistance and immediately fell apart. At the first sign of real combat, entire units fled. In one case, they even murdered their own general, accusing him of treason. The professional armies of Austria and Prussia, commanded by the Duke of Brunswick, began a slow, methodical, and seemingly unstoppable advance into France. It appeared the cynical royalist gamble was about to pay off. Paris itself was now vulnerable. This string of humiliating defeats sparked a wave of panic and fury in the capital. The Girondins, who had championed the war, were now on the defensive, and they deflected blame by intensifying their rhetoric against the king. They accused him of treason, claiming he and his Austrian committee at court were secretly relaying French military plans to the enemy. This suspicion hardened in late July 1792 when the Duke of Brunswick issued a proclamation to the people of Paris. The Brunswick Manifesto, as it became known, was intended to intimidate the city into submission. It warned that if any harm came to the French royal family, the Allied armies would inflict an exemplary and ever-memorable vengeance by giving up the city of Paris to military execution and total destruction. This was one of the most disastrous own goals in military history. The manifesto did not intimidate the Parisians, it enraged them. It was the final irrefutable proof that the king was in collusion with the foreign invaders. To threaten Paris was to threaten the revolution itself, and the people responded not with fear, but with a defiant surge of patriotic fury. The storming of the Tuileries and the September massacres. The radical sections of Paris, dominated by the artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers, who became known as the sans-culottes, or without knee breeches, a reference to their long trousers as opposed to the silk breeches of the aristocracy, began demanding the king's removal. On the night of August 9th, they took matters into their own hands. A new radical city government, the Paris Commune, was formed. In the early hours of August 10, 1792, a massive crowd of sans-culottes, joined by radical National Guard units from the provinces, marched on the Tuileries Palace. This was not a spontaneous uprising like the storming of the Bastille. It was an organized military assault. The palace was defended by a loyal contingent of some 900 Swiss guards. The king, seeing the massive, heavily armed mob approaching, made the decision to flee with his family through the gardens to the nearby Legislative Assembly, where he hoped the deputies would protect him. His departure left the Swiss guards in an untenable position. In the confusion, fighting broke out. The Swiss, known for their discipline and courage, initially drove back the attackers, but the revolutionaries, enraged by early losses, regrouped and brought up cannons. A brutal and merciless battle followed. The palace was stormed, and the Swiss guards, hopelessly outnumbered, were encircled and killed. Many were slain in the fighting. Others who surrendered were massacred by the vengeful crowd. The palace was looted. Its luxurious contents were destroyed in a symbolic rejection of royal decadence. The storming of the Tuileries was the bloody and violent end of the French monarchy. The Legislative Assembly, intimidated by the victorious Commune, had no choice but to formally suspend the king, place him and his family under arrest, and call for the election of a new assembly, the National Convention, to be elected by universal male suffrage to decide the future of France. In the wake of this second revolution, a dangerous power vacuum emerged. With the central government in disarray and the Prussian army continuing its advance, fear and paranoia reached a fever pitch. The radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat, in his popular newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, urged the public to kill the traitors in their midst before they could break out of the prisons and join the advancing enemy. In the first week of September, this paranoia boiled over into an orgy of violence. For several days, armed sans-culotte mobs broke into the prisons of Paris and began a vigilante justice. They set up impromptu revolutionary tribunals, holding mock trials before murdering the prisoners in the courtyards. The miracle of Valmy and the birth of the Republic. The initial targets were political prisoners and non-juring priests, those who refused to swear allegiance to the Constitution. But the violence soon spread to include thousands of common criminals, prostitutes, and petty debtors. The September massacres were a terrifying episode of popular justice at its most brutal, claiming the lives of an estimated 1,200 people. The authorities, weak and terrified, did nothing to stop it. And yet, just as the revolution seemed to be descending into a bloody abyss, a moment of miraculous deliverance occurred. On September 20th, at the Battle of Valmy, the newly organized French army, composed of a mix of old royal regulars and new revolutionary volunteers, held firm against the advancing Prussians. In a steady rain, the French artillery, the best in Europe, unleashed a devastating barrage that halted the Prussian advance. After a short, inconclusive exchange of fire, the Duke of Brunswick, unnerved by the unexpected French resolve, broke off the attack and began a long retreat. Militarily, Valmy was little more than a skirmish, but its psychological impact was immense. It was a stunning victory that saved the revolution. The great German writer Goethe, who was present at the battle, famously told his companions, "From this place and from this day forth begins a new era in the history of the world, and you can say that you were there." The The very next day, September 21, 1792, the newly elected National Convention met for the first time. Buoyed by the news from Valmy, its very first act was the formal abolition of the monarchy. France was declared a republic. The ancient kingdom, 1,000 years in the making, was gone. A new, uncertain, and dangerous era had begun. And the first question the new republic had to confront was a grim one. What to do with the man who had been its king? The new French Republic was born, but its cradle was surrounded by enemies. The victory at Valmy was a reprieve, not a final triumph, and the young nation was still locked in a desperate war with the great monarchies of Europe. At home, the divisions that would soon tear the revolution apart were already beginning to emerge. The National Convention was a battleground for two implacable factions. On one side were the Girondins, who had once been the radical leaders of the Legislative Assembly, but now represented a more moderate, provincial, and legalistic approach to the revolution. Arrayed against them, occupying the higher benches of the Assembly Hall, which earned them the name the Montagnards, or the Mountain, was the group of radicals based in the political clubs of Paris. Led by figures like the fiery orator Georges Danton and the cool ascetic Maximilien Robespierre. The Montagnards were closely aligned with the Parisian sans-culottes and believed that the revolution's survival depended on ruthless, centralized action. And the first and most pressing issue that divided them was the question of the king. Louis XVI, now stripped of his titles and referred to as the revolutionary name of Citizen Louis Capet, a reference to his distant medieval ancestor, was held with his family in the Temple, an old fortress prison in Paris. What should be done with him? The Girondins, for the most part, were deeply reluctant to put him on trial. They were lawyers and men of property, and they feared that executing the king would unleash further anarchy, alienate the provinces, and provoke the united fury of all Europe. They argued for imprisonment, exile, or at least a national referendum to decide his fate, a move they hoped would save his life. The Montagnards, by contrast, argued that trial and execution were a political necessity. Their brilliant young ideologue, the handsome and chillingly determined Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, articulated their position with icy logic. He declared before the convention, "The king is not an accused person. You do not have to pass judgment for or against a man, but to take a measure of public safety." For Saint-Just and Robespierre, the question was simple. The king's very existence was a threat to the republic. As long as he lived, he would be a rallying point for royalists and counter-revolutionaries. His life was incompatible with the life of the new nation. One cannot reign innocently, Saint-Just argued. Being a king was itself a crime against the people. He concluded with a chilling pronouncement, "This man must reign or die." Any lingering doubts about the necessity of a trial were swept away in November 1792 with a dramatic discovery. A locksmith in Paris reported the existence of a secret safe, armoire de fer, he had installed for the king in the wall of the Tuileries Palace. When the safe was opened, it yielded Louis' secret correspondence. The letters proved what the radicals had suspected all along. The king had been playing a double game. The documents revealed his secret dealings with émigré nobles, his contacts with foreign powers, and his deep-seated hostility to the very constitution he had sworn to uphold. It was a treasure trove of evidence establishing treason, making a trial inevitable. The king's duplicity was now plain for all to see.
The execution, regicide, accomplished. The trial began in December 1792 before the National Convention itself, which acted as both judge and jury. Louis was brought before the assembled deputies to hear the charges laid against him. Observers noted his calm, dignified, and somewhat detached demeanor.
He was charged with a long list of crimes against the nation, from conspiring against the revolution in its early days to the massacre of citizens during the storming of the Tuileries. He defended himself reasonably, arguing that his actions were always within his constitutional powers. But the trial was less a legal proceeding than a political performance. His guilt was a foregone conclusion. The real debate was over the punishment. In mid-January 1793, the convention held a dramatic marathon session to vote on the king's fate. The voting was done by roll call, with each of the 749 deputies required to stand one by one and publicly declare their verdict and their chosen penalty. For 24 hours, the tense process unfolded in a hall packed with spectators who cheered for death and hissed at any sign of moderation. The first vote on the question of guilt was nearly unanimous. A second vote on whether to submit the sentence to a popular referendum was narrowly defeated by the Montagnards, who feared the provinces would vote to pardon the king. The final, decisive vote was on the penalty. The hall was electric with tension as deputies cast their votes for imprisonment, exile, or death. When the final tally was announced, the margin was shockingly small. The death penalty passed by a margin of only one vote by some counts, though a final, more complex count showed a small but clear majority in favor of immediate, unconditional execution. Among those who voted for death was the king's own cousin, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, who had adopted the revolutionary name Philippe Égalité, a vote that shocked even some radicals. On the cold, foggy morning of January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was taken by carriage through the silent streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, Revolution Square, where the guillotine awaited. A vast crowd had gathered. He ascended the scaffold with a firm step, his demeanor calm and composed. He attempted to deliver a final speech to the crowd, his voice ringing out, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I forgive those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed will never fall upon France." But the commander of the National Guard, Antoine-Joseph Santerre, ordered a drum roll, and the rest of his words were drowned out. He was strapped to the plank, the heavy blade fell, and the executioner held up the former king's head to the cheering crowd. The execution of Citizen Capet was the point of no return. It was an act that horrified the courts of Europe and united them into a great coalition against the regicide republic. At home, it irrevocably deepened the divisions within France, making civil war nearly inevitable. The revolution had killed its king, and in doing so had declared war on the old world, both at home and abroad. The execution of the king was supposed to unite the republic, but it had the exact opposite effect. It was a gauntlet thrown down, an act of defiance that plunged France into the darkest and most desperate chapter of its revolution. The spring and summer of 1793 were a time of existential crisis, a period when the young republic seemed on the verge of tearing itself apart from a perfect storm of external invasion and internal revolt. The monarchies of Europe, horrified by the act of regicide, now joined the war against France in a great coalition. Great Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic entered the conflict, and the ring of enemies surrounding the nation was now complete. French armies, overextended and demoralized, began suffering a series of crushing defeats, and the threat of foreign invasion loomed larger than ever. At the same time, the nation was exploding from within. The economy was in a free fall. The government's relentless printing of assignats to pay for the war led to runaway inflation, rendering the paper currency nearly worthless. Food and essential goods prices soared, leading to bread riots and widespread social unrest among the sans-culottes in Paris, who demanded price controls and harsh measures against speculators. The most dangerous internal threat, however, came from the West. in the deeply Catholic and royalist region of the Vendée, the convention's order for a national draft, conscripting 300,000 men to fight the foreign war, was the final straw. It sparked a massive and brutal peasant uprising that quickly escalated into a full-scale counter-revolutionary civil war. The Vendéan rebels, fighting under the banner "For God and King," waged a bloody guerrilla campaign against the Republic, creating a vicious internal front that drained precious resources and manpower. This atmosphere of crisis brought the simmering political battle in the convention to a boil. The Girondins, who controlled the government, were blamed for the military defeats and economic chaos. The Mountain, led by Robespierre and Danton, allied ever closer with the radical sans-culottes of Paris, whose demands they channeled into the Assembly. They accused the Girondins of weakness, indecision, and secret sympathy for the king and the provinces. The Girondins, in turn, were appalled by the lawlessness of the Parisian mob and accused the Montagnards of aiming for a bloody dictatorship. The breaking point came on June 2, 1793. Tens of thousands of armed sans-culottes, backed by the Parisian National Guard, surrounded the convention and aimed cannons at the building. They demanded the arrest of the leading Girondin deputies. In a moment that would haunt the revolution, the convention capitulated to the armed mob. 29 Girondin deputies were expelled and placed under house arrest. The Montagnards and the Jacobins now had absolute control of the government. They had won, but they did so by violating the sanctity of the national representative body, a precedent that would soon be turned against themselves. To deal with this desperate multi-front war, the convention, even before the fall of the Girondins, had created a new executive body, the Committee of Public Safety, or Comité de Salut Public. Initially intended as a temporary war council, this 12-man committee would, over the next year, become all-powerful, effectively the government of France. Meeting secretly in a green carpeted room in the Tuileries Palace, they wielded immense authority, controlling the army, the bureaucracy, and the nation's finances. In July, Maximilien Robespierre, the quiet, fastidious lawyer from Arras, known to his followers as the Incorruptible, was elected to the committee. Terror as an emanation of virtue, the law of suspects. He would soon become the most dominant and emblematic figure of the committee. His cool, unwavering belief in the necessity of revolutionary virtue would give the committee its ideological and moral direction. Faced with foreign invasion, civil war, and economic chaos, the committee and its Montagnard allies in the convention concluded that only the most extreme measures could save the Republic. Under relentless pressure from the sans-culottes, who demanded that the traitors threatening the nation be punished, the convention proclaimed in September 1793 that terror is the order of the day. La terreur est à l'ordre du jour. This was the official beginning of the Reign of Terror, a year-long period of state violence and political repression that would become the most infamous and enduring legacy of the Revolution. The logic of the terror was grim and paradoxical. Its architects, like Robespierre, were true believers in the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and reason. They argued that to establish the new Republic of Virtue, a society of good and honest citizens, they must first purify the nation of all its corrupt and counter-revolutionary elements. Terror, in their view, was a necessary, if regrettable, tool, a form of emergency surgery to save the sick body of the Republic. It was, as Robespierre would later assert, an emanation of virtue, une émanation de la vertu, the swift and unwavering justice of the people's revolution against its enemies. To carry out this justice, the convention passed a series of draconian laws. The most significant of these was the Law of Suspects, Loi des Suspects. This decree created an incredibly broad and vague definition of who could be considered an enemy of the revolution. It targeted not only active royalists and rebels, but also anyone who, by their conduct, their contacts, their remarks, or their writings, have shown themselves to be partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. This could include people who failed to show enough enthusiasm for the revolution, merchants who hoarded goods, or anyone with simply the wrong family connections. It was a law that made suspicion itself a crime, creating the legal basis for a national witch hunt. To try these suspects, the government empowered the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris and similar bodies in the provinces. These were not ordinary courts, they were a political weapon. Their proceedings were expedited, the rights of the accused were severely limited, and the only possible verdicts were acquittal or death. The French Revolution had created a ruthlessly efficient legal machine designed not to weigh evidence, but to eliminate its enemies. The tool of this elimination, the guillotine, would now begin its grim and relentless work. The symbol of the Reign of Terror, more than any man or law, was a machine. It stood in the center of Paris on what had once been the Place Louis XV and was renamed the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine was the lead player in the grim theater of the Revolution. It was conceived by a committee led by Dr. Antoine Louis and advocated by the physician Joseph-Ignace Guillotin, the same man, we recall, who suggested the tennis court as a meeting place. It was intended as an instrument of enlightened humanitarian progress. Before the revolution, executions were a cruel and unequal spectacle. Nobles had the privilege of a swift beheading by sword, while commoners faced gruesome punishments like hanging, breaking on the wheel, or quartering. The guillotine, with its heavy, angled blade that fell with swift mechanical precision, was intended to make death instantaneous, painless, and above all, equal. Every citizen, from the king to the common baker, now faced the same national razor. But what began as a symbol of rational, egalitarian justice quickly became the symbol of relentless, industrialized death. Its rhythmic, daily work was a horrifying barometer of the revolution's slide into madness. Falling into the terror's net was a terrifyingly quick and arbitrary process. Often it began with a simple denunciation, a suspicious neighbor, a business rival, a rejected lover. Anyone could write a secret note to the local revolutionary surveillance committees, Comité de Surveillance, which existed in every district. These committees, staffed by zealous local patriots, decided whether there was a case to answer. If so, the accused was arrested in the middle of the night, their papers seized, their family left in a state of terrifying uncertainty. They were transported to one of the city's overflowing and squalid prisons, such as the Conciergerie, which became known as the antechamber of the guillotine. From there they were brought to the Revolutionary Tribunal. The court was a theatrical travesty of justice. The public prosecutor, the formidable Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, presented the state's case. The accused were given little time to prepare defense, and witnesses were rarely called. The judges, all staunch Jacobins, saw their role not as impartial arbitrators, but as patriots purging the nation of its enemies. The questions were leading, the evidence flimsy, and the verdict was almost always predetermined. From the tribunal, the condemned were loaded onto open carts called tombereaux for their final journey through the streets of Paris to the scaffold. This daily procession became a grim public spectacle. Crowds gathered to insult and jeer the prisoners, and a group of women, the infamous tricotées, sat at the foot of the guillotine, knitting indifferently as the heads fell. The terror consumed people from all walks of life. Its first and most famous victim was the former queen, Marie Antoinette. Her trial in October 1793 was a vicious piece of political theater. She was charged not only with treason, but with a string of vile and fabricated crimes, including the monstrous and baseless accusation of sexual abuse against her own son. She endured the trial with a calm, regal dignity that even her enemies acknowledged. as she was carted to the scaffold in an open tombre. An artist's sketch by Jacques-Louis David captured her emaciated, aged face and her hands bound behind her back, a stark image of the fallen monarch. Her execution was followed by that of the 21 expelled Girondin leaders. They met their end with defiant courage, reportedly singing the revolutionary anthem, the Marseillaise, as they mounted the scaffold one by one, their voices growing fainter until the last man was silenced.
The horror in the provinces and the contradictions of the terror. The revolution, in its paranoia, began to consume its own entrails. Olympe de Gouges, the feminist author of the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, was guillotined for her political moderation. Madame Roland, the brilliant woman who ran one of the Girondin faction's most influential intellectual salons, was also executed. Ascending the scaffold, she uttered the famous last words that perfectly captured the tragic irony of the terror. "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" This violence was not confined to Paris. In fact, the most extreme and brutal episodes of the terror occurred in the provinces, where the government sought to crush counter-revolutionary uprisings with ruthless force. The city of Lyon, which had rebelled against the Jacobin government, was made into a terrifying example. The convention decreed that Lyon is no more. Its name was to be erased from the map, and its buildings torn down. The guillotine was deemed too slow to deal with the vast numbers of the condemned. Instead, hundreds of rebels were marched out to open fields, tied together in groups, and mown down by cannon fire in what became known as les mitraillés, or grape-shot executions. In the city of Nantes, the local convention representative, Jean-Baptiste Carrier, seeking to crush the remnants of the Vendée revolt, invented an even more horrifying method of mass execution. Thousands of prisoners, including priests, nuns, and suspected royalists, were loaded onto barges, taken to the middle of the Loire River, and deliberately sunk. These mass drownings, notoriously known as les noyés, the drownings, became a symbol of the terror at its most depraved. In total, the Reign of Terror exacted a huge human cost. The official tally of executions by sentence of the revolutionary tribunals was about 17,000 across France. But this number excludes the tens of thousands who died in the provincial massacres, or the hundreds of thousands who perished in the savage civil war in the Vendée. The terror was a period of profound national trauma, a time when the noble ideals of 1789 were drowned in a sea of blood and suspicion. It saved the Republic from its immediate military threats, but it did so at a terrible cost, leaving a legacy of bitterness and a stain on the memory of the revolution that would never be fully erased. By the spring of 1794, the Reign of Terror had achieved its primary objectives. French armies, galvanized by the national draft and the war economy, had turned the tide against the foreign coalition. The Vendée revolt had been brutally suppressed, and the other Federalist uprisings were crushed. The Republic seemed to be saved. Yet the guillotine in Paris was working faster than ever. The emergency had passed, but the terror, having developed its own logic and inertia, only intensified. The Jacobin government, which had been a monolithic force in the fight against the Girondins, now began to fracture under the immense pressure, splintering into warring factions, each with its own vision for the revolution's future. On the far left were the radical atheists known as the Hébertins, named after their leader, the intemperate and popular journalist Jacques Hébert. The Hébertins had a strong following among the Parisian sans-culottes and were the driving force behind the campaign of de-Christianization, which included closing churches, forcing priests to marry, and promoting the atheistic cult of reason. They demanded ever more radical economic measures,
a war to the death against all merchants and the wealthy, and a further intensification of the terror. On the other side, a new faction of the indulgents or moderates began to form around Georges Danton. Danton, the charismatic orator who had rallied the nation against the Prussian invasion, had grown weary of the continuous bloodshed. He and his allies, like the journalist Camille Desmoulins, began to argue that the terror had served its purpose and that it was time to establish a committee of clemency. They believed the revolution needed to return to normalcy, to heal its wounds, and end the paranoia that was tearing the country apart. "I would rather be guillotined than guillotine others," Danton famously declared, a phrase that was a direct challenge to the ruling orthodoxy. The fall of Danton and the Great Terror. Danton's trial was a dramatic spectacle. The great orator, whose voice had once shaken the foundations of the monarchy, fought for his life with all his old fire. But the outcome was never in doubt. The trial was rigged, and he and his followers were condemned. As he was led to the scaffold, Danton reportedly gave a prediction to the executioner: "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." His final words were a message for his great rival: "You will follow me, Robespierre." With the execution of the Hébertists and the Dantonists, Robespierre was now the undisputed master of the revolution. He stood alone, his rivals eliminated, his power seemingly absolute, but his position was dangerously isolated. He had silenced the voice of the people in the streets of Paris and executed the revolution's most beloved and charismatic figures. His power now rested almost entirely on a foundation of fear. In the ominous silence that followed the purges, Robespierre attempted to impose his unique moral vision on the nation. A deist who believed in God but loathed the Catholic Church, he established a new state religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. This was an abstract civic religion designed to instill a belief in a benevolent creator and the immortality of the soul, which he felt was a necessary foundation for a virtuous republic. In a bizarre and surreal spectacle on June 8, 1794, he personally presided over the Festival of the Supreme Being in Paris, marching at the head of a great procession clad in a sky-blue coat, acting as a sort of high priest of his new faith. To many observers, his messianic performance felt not inspiring but deeply unsettling. It looked like the prelude to a personal dictatorship. Just 2 days after this festival, Robespierre pushed a terrifying new law through the convention, the Law of 22 Prairial. This law dramatically accelerated the terror. It stripped the accused of the right to counsel, left the revolutionary tribunal with only 2 possible verdicts, acquittal or death, and allowed conviction based not on evidence, but on the vague moral certainty of the jurors. The result was a terrifying surge in executions. In the 6 weeks before this law, the Parisian guillotine claimed about 500 victims. In the 6 weeks after, it claimed over 1,300. This final feverish period of bloodshed became known as the Great Terror. But the terror was now consuming itself. The purges had created a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia within the government itself. No one felt safe. Members of the National Convention who had seen Hébert and Danton led to their deaths now began to fear they would be next. Robespierre, becoming increasingly alienated and paranoid, made a fatal error. In a rambling speech to the convention on July 26th, 8 Thermidor in the new revolutionary calendar, he spoke of a new conspiracy against the Republic and claimed he had a new list of traitors, but refused to name them. This vague threat became the death warrant for the conspiracy that would overthrow him. Every deputy in the hall, fearing their name might be on that secret list, now had a personal incentive to strike first. The next day, 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, when Robespierre and his ally Saint-Just rose to speak, they were shouted down. A prearranged chorus of deputies began to cry out, "Down with the tyrant!" The convention, in a sudden and dramatic reversal, voted for the arrest of Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, and their key allies. They were taken away, but the Parisian Commune, still loyal to Robespierre, managed to free them and brought them to the Hôtel de Ville, hoping to rally the sans-culottes for a one last stand. But the people of Paris did not rise. The execution of Hébert had broken their spirit. In the early hours of the morning, troops loyal to the convention stormed the city hall. Robespierre was found with a shattered jaw from a pistol shot. Whether it was a suicide attempt or a wound sustained in the raid remains a historical enigma. The next day, the architect of the terror, along with 21 of his closest followers, was taken to the Place de la Révolution and guillotined without trial. The reign of terror was over.
The Thermidorian reaction, conservatism, and chaos. The fall of Robespierre on 9th Thermidor was not initially intended to end the revolution, but merely to end the terror's suffocating grip on the politicians themselves. The men who overthrew him, the Thermidorians, were not royalists or moderates. They were fellow Jacobins and former terrorists who acted out of self-preservation. But the wave of public revulsion against the reign of terror that followed Robespierre's death was so powerful that it swept them along, leading to a period of dramatic political and social reversal known as the Thermidorian reaction. France, exhausted by the relentless demands of revolutionary virtue and bloodshed, now swung sharply in a more conservative and chaotic direction. The first and most urgent task was the dismantling of the terror machine. The law of 22 Prairial was immediately repealed. The Revolutionary Tribunal was gradually stripped of its powers and ultimately abolished. The feared Committee of Public Safety was reduced to a mere subcommittee with limited powers. Prison doors were flung open, releasing tens of thousands of suspects who had been awaiting their turn on the tombereau. The Jacobin Club, the fanatical heart of Montagnard rule, was closed and its leaders arrested or gone into hiding. This was a complete repudiation of the Robespierrist state. This political shift was mirrored by a dramatic cultural transformation. The austere, puritanical Republic of Virtue gave way to a sudden explosion of ostentatious consumption, hedonism, and social extravagance. A new youth culture emerged, the Gilded Youth, Jeunesse Dorée, gangs of young upper-middle-class men who dressed in foppish, exaggerated fashions with high collars and long pigtails. They roamed the streets of Paris, armed with heavy canes, engaging in street fights with remaining Jacobins, and leading a campaign to tear down revolutionary symbols like the red cap of liberty. Theaters reopened with frivolous plays, and lavish balls were held. Most notorious was the grotesque Ball of the Victims, Bal des Victimes, where only people who had lost a relative to the guillotine were admitted, often wearing a thin red ribbon around their necks in grim imitation of the blade's track. This was a society emerging from collective trauma, desperately wishing to forget the recent past and embrace the pleasures of the present. This reaction also had an uglier side. A white terror erupted in the provinces, a wave of vigilante justice and revenge murders as royalists and the families of the victims tracked down and assassinated former Jacobin officials and local terrorists. While the rich celebrated, the poor starved. The Thermidorian government, dominated by the propertied bourgeoisie, rapidly dismantled the economic controls of the Jacobin era. They repealed the maximum, the system of price controls on bread and other basic goods. The result was catastrophic for the urban working class.
the value of the assignat plummeted and inflation spiraled out of control. A devastatingly harsh winter in 1794-95 led to famine conditions even worse than those of 1789. Once again, the cry for bread echoed through the streets of Paris. In the spring of 1795, the sans-culottes staged a final desperate insurrection. During the insurrection of 12 Germinal, they stormed the National Convention Hall, demanding bread and the Constitution of 1793, the radical Jacobin constitution that had been drafted but never implemented. They even managed to murder one of the deputies, parading his head on a pike through the hall. But this time, there were no sympathetic Jacobins in power to support them. The convention called in the army, which, for the first time, used overwhelming force to crush the popular uprising. The working-class districts were surrounded and disarmed. The Germinal insurrection was the final, decisive political defeat of the sans-culottes. The street politics that had driven the revolution forward since the fall of the Bastille had ended. The power of the mob was broken. The coming of Napoleon, the Directory, and the whiff of grape shot. Having solidified their authority against the Jacobin left and the Parisian mob, the Thermidorians proceeded to create a new constitution that would lock in their vision of a stable bourgeois republic and prevent a return either to royalist tyranny or radical democracy. The Constitution of the Year 3, 1795, was a deeply conservative document. It returned power to the propertied classes, reintroducing a property qualification for voting, effectively disenfranchising most of the adult male population to prevent the rise of another dictator like Robespierre. It created a system of checks and balances. The legislative body was split into two chambers, the lower chamber, the Council of 500, which proposed laws, and the upper chamber, the Council of Ancients, which approved or rejected them. Executive power was vested in a five-man committee known as the Directory. These 5 directors, elected by the legislature, were meant to provide stable leadership. But a system of annual rotations and the potential for internal strife often led to paralysis and intrigue. The new constitution was immediately attacked, not by the left, but by the right. Royalists in Paris, believing the revolution had run its course, saw an opportunity to restore the monarchy. In October 1795, 13 Vendémiaire by the revolutionary calendar, a large royalist mob marched on the convention, seeking to overthrow the new government before it could take office. The defense of the convention was entrusted to a young and still relatively unknown artillery general who happened to be in the city, Napoleon Bonaparte. With characteristic ruthlessness and efficiency, Bonaparte lined up his cannons, and, as the royalist columns advanced, he dispersed them with what he would later famously call a whiff of grape shot. The streets were cleared in minutes. The insurrection was crushed. This event was a crucial turning point. It saved the new Directory, but it also demonstrated with brutal clarity that the new government's authority ultimately rested not on popular support or constitutional legitimacy, but on the bayonets of the army. And it brought the ambitious young general who saved it to the attention of France's new political masters. The Directory government, established in 1795, was a government of survivors. The 5 directors who held executive power, along with the members of the 2 legislative councils, were mostly moderates and former revolutionaries who had managed to navigate the treacherous currents of the terror and emerge with their heads intact. Their main goal was to maintain a precarious balance, preventing a return to Jacobin radicalism on the left or a royalist reaction on the right. The result was a 4-year period of chronic instability, corruption, and political intrigue. The government was constantly harassed by conspiracies, struggled with a depreciating currency, and was sustained by a series of mini coups that relied on military intervention. This weak and cynical government, born of exhaustion, created the perfect power vacuum for the ascent of an extraordinary individual. The man who saved the Directory at its birth was the young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was not a product of old France. He was born Napoleone Buonaparte in 1769 on the island of Corsica, just 1 year after it had been annexed by France. He came from a minor Corsican nobility and always spoke French with a heavy Italian accent. He was, in all senses, an outsider. As a child, he was sent to military schools in mainland France, where he was a lonely, diligent, and often bullied child, looked down upon by his aristocratic French classmates for his provincial origins and his fierce Corsican pride. The revolution made him. The flight of thousands of aristocratic officers created a vacuum in the army, opening up incredible opportunities for rapid advancement based on talent and ambition rather than birth.
The rise of the artillerist, the Italian campaign. Napoleon, a brilliant and fiercely ambitious student of artillery and military history, was perfectly positioned to seize this opportunity. His first chance to distinguish himself came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon. An important southern port city had rebelled against the Jacobin government and welcomed the British fleet into its harbor. Young Captain Bonaparte, who was given command of the Revolutionary Army's artillery, devised a brilliant and daring plan. He realized that by seizing the commanding heights overlooking the harbor, he could rain artillery fire down on the British ships, forcing them to evacuate. His plan worked perfectly. Toulon was retaken, and the young captain, who was wounded in the thigh during the assault, was hailed as a hero. His performance caught the eye of Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother, and he was promoted to brigadier general at the age of just 24. After a brief period of uncertainty following the fall of Robespierre, his decisive suppression of the royalist uprising in Paris in 1795, the famous whiff of grape shot, made him a household name and a favorite general of the new Directory. The directors, however, were nervous. Napoleon was popular, charismatic, and disturbingly ambitious. They wanted him out of Paris. In 1796, they offered him command of the French army in Italy. This was considered a secondary front, a ragged and poorly supplied force meant to create a small diversion while the main French armies attacked Austria through Germany. For Napoleon, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He arrived to find an army that was demoralized, underfed, and unpaid. But in his first address to the troops, he electrified them with a promise of glory and riches. "Soldiers," he declared, "you are naked, badly fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." What followed was one of the most stunning and brilliant military campaigns in history. Napoleon's strategic genius was unlike anything the old armies of Europe had seen. He eschewed the slow, methodical warfare of the 18th century and moved with lightning speed, forcing his army to march at a pace that constantly confounded his Austrian and Piedmontese opponents. His core principle was the concentration of force. He kept his army separated for rapid movement, but then converged with overwhelming numbers at the decisive point of battle, destroying enemy armies piece by piece. He inspired his men with a combination of easy familiarity and a powerful aura of command. He knew his soldiers by name, shared their hardships, and rewarded bravery on the spot. In a whirlwind campaign, he defeated the armies of Piedmont, forcing them to sue for peace, and then drove the Austrians out of Lombardy, winning a string of dazzling victories at places like the Bridge of Lodi and, most decisively, the Battle of Rivoli in Italy.
Napoleon behaved less like a general of the Republic and more like a conquering Roman proconsul. He acted in complete independence of the government in Paris. He created new sister republics, such as the Cisalpine Republic in northern Italy, with constitutions modeled on the French pattern. He levied massive financial contributions on the Italian states, which not only paid for his army, but sent a river of treasure back to the bankrupt Directory. And he systematically plundered Italy's greatest art masterpieces, paintings by Raphael and Titian, ancient Roman sculptures, and shipped them to Paris for display in the Louvre as a symbol of French national glory. Finally, in 1797, he personally negotiated a peace treaty with Austria, the Treaty of Campo Formio, completely redrawing the map of northern Italy and securing a triumphant peace. All of this without the full consent of his own government. Egypt and the Directory's collapse. He returned to Paris a conquering hero, his popularity eclipsing that of the 5 directors. Once again, they were desperate to get him away from the center of power. Napoleon, dreaming of emulating Alexander the Great, proposed an even more exotic and ambitious plan, an invasion of Egypt. The strategic goal was to strike at the power of Great Britain by threatening its overland routes to India. The Directory, delighted at the prospect of sending their brilliant but troublesome general and his veteran army to the far shore of the Mediterranean, readily agreed. In 1798, a massive French fleet set sail. The campaign started with a swift victory. Napoleon's army seized Malta and then landed in Egypt, crushing the Mameluke cavalry at the famous Battle of the Pyramids. But just weeks later, the British admiral Horatio Nelson located the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, and in a stunning naval victory, the Battle of the Nile, completely annihilated it. Napoleon had conquered Egypt, but he and his entire army were now trapped, cut off from France by the dominant British fleet. The great conqueror's eastern dream had turned into a gilded prison. While Napoleon was isolated in Egypt, fighting fruitless campaigns in the Syrian sands and overseeing the cataloging of ancient ruins, the government he served was collapsing again. By 1799, the Directory was deeply unpopular, bankrupt, and universally regarded as hopelessly corrupt. A new second coalition of European powers, led by Austria and Russia, had formed against France, and its armies were inflicting a series of major defeats on French forces in Italy and Germany. The sister republics Napoleon had created were collapsing, and France itself was once again facing the threat of invasion. At home, political instability was endemic. Annual elections were a constant source of turmoil, and the government lurched between suppressing royalist conspiracies on the right and a Jacobin revival on the left. The nation was weary of a decade of revolution, war, and political chaos. There was a deep and growing desire for stability, for a leader who could restore order and secure the gains of the revolution. Inside the government itself, a powerful group of conspirators had come to the same conclusion. They believed the Directory, with its weak executive and fractured legislature, was incapable of saving the Republic. They decided the only solution was a coup d'etat, a swift and illegal seizure of power to impose a new, more authoritarian constitution. The intellectual leader of this conspiracy was a familiar name, Abbé Sieyès, the man whose pamphlet, What is the Third Estate, had ignited the revolution back in 1789. Now, 10 years later, Sieyès was one of the 5 directors, and his faith in popular democracy was completely shattered. He had drafted a new constitution that would concentrate power in a strong executive, but he knew the legislative councils would never vote to dissolve themselves. He needed a sword, a popular and loyal general who could provide the military force to intimidate the politicians and secure the coup. As the conspiracy was taking shape, news arrived in France that seemed like a miracle. Napoleon Bonaparte had landed. Learning of the crisis at home, Napoleon made a risky and decisive move. He abandoned his army in Egypt, leaving it under the command of a subordinate, and secretly boarded a small, fast ship. In a journey that was part luck, part audacity, he managed to evade the patrolling British fleet and landed on the southern coast of France in October 1799. The failure of his Egyptian campaign and the fact that he had technically deserted his post were conveniently ignored. To the French people, his return was seen as an act of providence. He was hailed not as a deserter, but as the savior of the nation, the one man who could defeat France's enemies and restore its glory. His journey from the coast to Paris was a triumphal procession. When Napoleon arrived in the capital, he was immediately approached by the conspirators. They were his perfect sword. A secret alliance was formed between the ambitious general and the intriguing politician. Together, they plotted the overthrow of the very government Napoleon had sworn to protect. The date was set for 18 Brumaire, year 8 of the revolutionary calendar, November 9th, 1799. The coup began smoothly. Early in the morning, the Council of Ancients, the upper house of the legislature, where the conspirators had the most influence, was convened. They were told of a fabricated Jacobin plot to overthrow the Republic. In the panic that followed, the council voted for two emergency measures. First, to relocate both legislative councils for their safety to the Palace of St. Cloud, located just outside the military cordon of Paris. And second, to appoint General Bonaparte as commander of all troops in the capital to protect them from this alleged plot. The first phase worked perfectly. Two of the 5 directors, Sieyès and his ally, resigned. The other 3 were placed under house arrest. The executive power was paralyzed, and Napoleon now controlled the army. The next day, 19th Brumaire, the plan began to unravel. The deputies of both councils convened at St. Cloud, but the delay had given them time to think. They grew suspicious of the vague Jacobin plot and began to sense that they themselves were the real targets. The Council of 500, the lower house, filled with fiery and unpredictable Jacobins, was in turmoil. Napoleon, who was a master of the battlefield but a novice at parliamentary politics, decided he needed to address them personally. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. When he entered the Council of Ancients Hall, his nervous, rambling speech was met with skepticism. He then proceeded to the far more hostile Council of 500. As soon as he entered, the deputies erupted in furious shouts. "Down with the dictator! Outlaw him!" They surrounded him, grabbing his collar, shoving, and accusing him of being a new Caesar. The great general, who had not flinched before Austrian cannons, was utterly overwhelmed by this verbal and physical assault. He turned pale, nearly fainted, and had to be dragged from the room by his grenadiers. The coup was on the verge of collapse. Napoleon was shaken, and the deputies were about to vote to declare him an outlaw, which would have meant his arrest and execution. The day was saved by his younger brother Lucien Bonaparte, who, by an incredible stroke of luck for the conspirators, happened to be the sitting president of the Council of 500. While the deputies raged inside, Lucien rushed out to the palace courtyard, where the soldiers charged with guarding the legislature were waiting. He leapt onto a horse, drew his sword, and delivered the performance of his life. He told the soldiers that the vast majority of the council was being terrorized by a small band of deputies who were in the pay of the English and who had tried to murder their general with daggers. Dramatically placing his sword against his brother's chest, he swore he would be the first to kill Napoleon if he ever betrayed the principles of the revolution. This theatrical lie was all the justification the wavering soldiers needed. Led by the cavalry commander Joachim Murat, the grenadiers fixed bayonets, advanced to the beat of a drum, and stormed the assembly hall. As the soldiers burst in, the deputies, the elected representatives of the French nation scattered in panic, climbing out windows and disappearing into the woods. The French Revolution's decade-long experiment with parliamentary democracy was over, dispersed by the force of bayonets. That same evening, a hand-picked group of remaining deputies was assembled to formally abolish the Directory and appoint 3 provisional consuls to run the state: Sieyès, another director, and of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. Everyone knew who was truly in charge.
The consulate, autocracy in disguise. The revolution that began with a cry for liberty ended with the quiet step of marching soldiers. The coup of 18 Brumaire had succeeded. The new government was an awkward 3-headed creature. The provisional consuls, Napoleon, Sieyès, and another man named Roger Ducos, were tasked with writing yet another constitution, the 4th in a decade. Sieyès, the veteran political theorist, believed his moment had finally arrived. He submitted a complex, carefully crafted design for a government with checks and balances, a system designed to prevent the emergence of any single powerful dictator. It included a grand elector, a purely ceremonial head of state, and a number of councils to diffuse power. Napoleon, however, had no intention of being a ceremonial figurehead or sharing power with anyone. With a combination of skillful political maneuvering and sheer force of will, he took Sieyès' intricate plan, thanked him for his work, and completely rewrote it to serve his own ambition. The resulting constitution of the year 8 was a masterpiece of autocracy in disguise. It paid lip service to the idea of popular sovereignty, but was engineered to concentrate all real power in the hands of one man. It established a government called the consulate. It was led by 3 consuls, but this was a deliberate illusion of divided power. The second and third consuls had only consultative votes. All executive power, the ability to appoint ministers, control the army, and propose laws, was vested in the first consul. And the Constitution, of course, named Napoleon Bonaparte to that post for 10 years. The legislature was a shadow of its former self, divided into 3 different bodies with confusing and overlapping roles, all designed to be weak and subservient to the first consul's will. The people's right to vote was preserved in theory, but it was rendered meaningless by a system of indirect elections so convoluted that it had no real impact on the composition of the government. Napoleon was a brilliant propagandist and understood his rule needed the appearance of popular consent. He submitted his new constitution to a plebiscite, a direct vote of the people. The results, announced in February 1800, were a stunning success. Over 3 million Frenchmen voted yes, with only about 1,500 voting no. While his brother Lucien, now Minister of the Interior, almost certainly adjusted the results to look more impressive, the vote nonetheless reflected a genuine national sentiment. The French people were exhausted by 10 years of revolutionary turmoil. They craved order, stability, and a leader who could guarantee the core gains of the revolution: equality before the law, the abolition of feudalism, and the security of property. Being more than willing to trade the messy business of political liberty for the promise of strong, effective government, they embraced Napoleon with gratitude. Napoleon's first priority as first consul was to end the war that was once again threatening France's borders. The Second Coalition was still active, and the Austrians had recaptured much of Italy. In a move that captured the imagination of Europe, Napoleon resolved to repeat his earlier triumphs. In the spring of 1800, he led his army in a daring and difficult march across the treacherous Great St. Bernard Pass in the Alps, emulating the ancient Carthaginian general Hannibal. He descended into Italy, taking the Austrian army by surprise. The decisive battle came on June 14, 1800, at the Battle of Marengo. It was a close-run affair. By mid-afternoon, the French army was on the brink of defeat, but the timely arrival of reinforcements and a brilliantly executed cavalry charge turned the tide of the battle, transforming it into a stunning French victory.
Marengo cemented Napoleon's military reputation and his political power at home. Austria was forced to the negotiating table, signing the Treaty of Luneville in 1801, which confirmed French control over Italy and the western bank of the Rhine. A year later, in 1802, he achieved an even greater victory by signing the Peace of Amiens with Great Britain. For the first time in a decade, the guns fell silent. Europe was at peace. While his armies secured peace abroad, Napoleon worked with tireless energy to secure peace at home, healing the deep wounds that had been tearing French society apart. He offered a general amnesty to émigré aristocrats, allowing tens of thousands of them to return to France, provided they swore an oath of loyalty to the new regime. This act helped to end the internal war against the nobility and brought sorely needed talent and expertise back to the country. His most brilliant act of reconciliation was the Concordat of 1801, a landmark agreement with the Pope that ended the bitter decade-long schism between the French state and the Catholic Church. Recall that the civil constitution of the clergy had been one of the Revolution's greatest mistakes. Napoleon, though not particularly religious man himself, was a pragmatist who understood the power of faith. Society is impossible without inequality. Inequality is impossible without morality, and morality is impossible without religion, he once remarked. He saw the church not as an enemy, but as a useful pillar of social order, a social glue. The Concordat was a masterful compromise. The Pope agreed to recognize the French Republic and, crucially, accepted the final loss of church lands that had been sold off during the Revolution. In return, the French government recognized Catholicism not as the state religion, but as the religion of the great majority of the French people. It also agreed to pay the salaries of the clergy, who would be nominated by the state but consecrated by the Pope. The Concordat pacified the rebellious Catholic regions, ended the counter-revolution, and brought millions of devout French citizens back into the fold of the nation. It was a classic Napoleonic solution. Pragmatic, authoritarian, and designed to bring a fractured institution under tight state control. Through military victory and shrewd political reconciliation, the first consul was rapidly transforming himself from merely a general into the undisputed master of France.
Napoleon's legacy, the Civil Code. With France's borders secured and its internal religious conflicts pacified, Napoleon turned his boundless energy to a project that was in many ways more ambitious than any military campaign: the creation of a single, unified legal code for all of France. This would become his most enduring and far-reaching legacy, a monumental achievement that would outlast all his battlefield victories. Before the Revolution, the legal landscape of France was a bewildering and chaotic jungle. A popular saying held that a traveler in France changed laws as often as he changed horses. The north of the country operated under a system of customary law, a patchwork of hundreds of different local customs stemming from old Germanic traditions. The south, by contrast, operated under a system based on ancient Roman law. Layered on top of this fundamental division were strata of feudal law, ecclesiastical canon law, and special royal edicts that often contradicted one another. The Revolution had, in theory, swept all this away with the promise of one law for all. But a decade of turmoil had prevented the creation of a new comprehensive system. Napoleon saw this legal chaos as an obstacle to national unity and efficient administration. He wanted a single set of clear, rational, and accessible laws that applied to every citizen from the English Channel to the Mediterranean. This was a classic Enlightenment project, and he pursued it with his customary speed and determination. In 1800, he appointed a commission of 4 distinguished jurists to draft a new civil code. But unlike most rulers, he did not just delegate the task. He became an active and obsessive participant in the process. Of the more than 100 sessions held by the Council of State to discuss the draft, Napoleon personally presided over more than half.
He would arrive at the meetings, often late at night after a full day of other state affairs, and plunge into complex legal debates with astonishing energy and intellect. He was not a lawyer, but his mind was sharp, pragmatic, and intolerant of abstract legal theory. He constantly cut through the jurist's technical jargon, demanding clarity and common sense. "Explain this to me as if I were a simple family man," he insisted. He brought his soldier's mind to the task, aiming to create a code that was like a well-drilled army, orderly, efficient, and unambiguous. The final work, promulgated in 1804 as the Code Civil des Français, and later renamed to Code Napoleon, was a brilliant synthesis of the old and the new. The Napoleonic Code was, first and foremost, a revolutionary document that cemented the great principles of 1789 into permanent law. Its foundational principle was equality before the law. All the old privileges of the nobility and clergy were gone forever. All Frenchmen were now equal citizens in the eyes of the court. It enshrined the right of individuals to choose their profession, formally abolishing the restrictive medieval guild system. It guaranteed freedom of conscience, upholding the principle of religious toleration. But its most important revolutionary legacy was its fierce protection of private property. The code made property ownership an absolute, sacred, and inviolable right. This was a crucial step that reassured the two groups who had benefited most from the revolution, the bourgeoisie and the peasantry. It guaranteed that their possession of the lands and assets they had acquired from the nationalization of church holdings and émigré nobility would be protected by the full might of the state forever. In this sense, it was the legal foundation of the new bourgeois France. However, the code was also a deeply conservative and patriarchal document that reflected Napoleon's authoritarian views on social order. While it enshrined the legal equality of men, it took a dramatic step backward in its treatment of women. The more liberal revolutionary laws on family and divorce were thrown out. The code placed the family under the absolute authority of the husband and father. The wife was legally subordinate to her husband. She could not sign a contract, run a business, or sell property without his permission. The grounds for divorce were severely restricted, especially for women. A husband could sue for divorce over a single act of adultery, while a wife could only do so if her husband brought his mistress to live in the family home. The code explicitly stated, "The husband owes protection to his wife. The wife owes obedience to her husband." Children were likewise placed under the absolute authority of their father until they reached adulthood. In its approach to the family, the Napoleonic Code was not revolutionary. It was a return to the patriarchal traditions of ancient Rome, establishing a rigid, hierarchical family structure that Napoleon deemed the necessary foundation for a stable and ordered state. In its approach to the family, the Napoleonic Code was not revolutionary. It was a return to the patriarchal traditions of ancient Rome, establishing a rigid, hierarchical family structure that Napoleon deemed the necessary foundation for a stable and ordered state. The historical impact of the Napoleonic Code cannot be overstated. It provided France with a single, modern legal system that, with some modification, remains the basis of its law to this day. But its influence spread far beyond France. As Napoleon's armies conquered Europe, they carried the code with them. It was imposed or adopted by vast territories, including Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of Germany and Italy, and the Netherlands.
The legacy of the Napoleonic Code, exporting the revolution. It swept away the tangled remnants of feudal law across much of the continent, replacing them with a single, rational system. Even after Napoleon's fall, the code often remained in place, an enduring legacy of the French occupation. Its clarity and logic were so admired that it became the model for the legal systems of over 20 nations worldwide, from Poland in Europe to Egypt in the Middle East, Japan and Asia, and almost all of Latin America.
The French Revolution's most successful and long-lasting export was, in the end, not the guillotine or the radicalism of the Jacobins, but the quiet, rational, and profoundly influential pages of Napoleon's Great Law Code. Napoleon's rule as First Consul brought France a period of peace, stability, and remarkable institutional achievement. He ended the wars, healed the religious schism, and gave the nation a unified legal code. His popularity was enormous. Most French people saw him as the savior of the nation, the man who had consolidated the best parts of the revolution while bringing a definitive end to its destructive chaos. But for a man of Napoleon's boundless ambition, being a temporary first consul, even with a 10-year term, was not enough. He sought a power that was not merely absolute, but permanent. From consul to emperor. The execution of the Duc d'Enghien. Using a series of royalist assassination plots as a pretext, he argued that his life was constantly under threat, and that if he were killed, the nation would plunge back into chaos. The only way to guarantee stability, his supporters claimed, was to make his rule lifelong. In 1802, another plebiscite was held, and the French people, again choosing order over liberty, voted overwhelmingly to make Napoleon Bonaparte first consul for life, with the right to name his successor. The Republic was now a monarchy in all but name. The final transformation from a republic to a dynastic empire was driven by a combination of Napoleon's personal ambition and his cold political calculation. In 1804, another major royalist conspiracy to assassinate him was uncovered. Napoleon, enraged and determined to send a ruthless message to his Bourbon enemies, resolved on an act of calculated state terror. His police informed him that a Bourbon prince, the young Duc d'Enghien, was living just across the border in the neutral German state of Baden and was believed to be involved in the plot. In a blatant violation of international law, Napoleon sent a squad of French dragoons to cross the Rhine, kidnap the prince, and bring him back to Paris. The Duke was innocent of the specific plot, but it didn't matter. He was subjected to a secret summary court-martial in the middle of the night at the Château de Vincennes and was executed by a firing squad in the castle moat just before dawn. The execution of the Duc d'Enghien sent a wave of horror through the royal courts of Europe, who saw it as banditry and murder. But it served two very specific purposes for Napoleon. First, it sent a clear and brutal message to the Bourbons that he would stop at nothing to defend his power. Second, and more subtly, it was a message to the old revolutionaries in France. By shedding Bourbon blood, Napoleon irrevocably broke with the old dynasty. He signaled to the men who had voted for the death of Louis XVI that there was no going back. They could never trust a restored Bourbon king to pardon them. Their only safety, he implied, was to permanently link their fate with his own. He made himself the only alternative to a royalist restoration. Amidst the threat of plots and assassination, the argument was once again made that only a hereditary system could secure the future. If Napoleon's rule became a dynasty, his death would not matter, as his heir would simply succeed him, rendering any assassination attempt meaningless. In May 1804, the Senate, a body filled with Napoleon's loyal followers, formally petitioned him to accept a new title. On May 18th, a new constitution was proclaimed, declaring that the government of the Republic was now entrusted to an emperor. The French Republic was dead. The First French Empire was born. The choice of title was deliberate and brilliant. He did not call himself king, a title tainted by the memory of feudalism and the weak Louis XVI. He chose emperor, a title that evoked the glories of ancient Rome and the legacy of Charlemagne, suggesting a power that was modern, military, and pan-European. and he was to be Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, a title that, like the King of the French before it, maintained the crucial fiction that his power derived from the people, not from divine right. The grand climax of this transformation occurred on December 2, 1804, in a coronation ceremony of breathtaking splendor held at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Napoleon was determined to create an instant and unforgettable spectacle of dynastic legitimacy. He summoned Pope Pius VII from Rome to preside over the ceremony, seeking the highest religious consecration for his new regime. But he was also determined to show that he was not a creature of the church. The cathedral was draped in lavish neoclassical imperial style, and the ceremony itself was a meticulously staged political theater. When the moment of the crowning arrived, the Pope prepared to lift the crown and place it on the emperor's head. But in a gesture of astonishing and pre-planned audacity, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands, turned his back to the altar, and facing the congregation, placed it upon his own head. He then took a second crown and placed it on the head of his wife, Josephine, whom he crowned Empress. The symbolism was unmistakable and profound. By crowning himself, Napoleon made a clear and powerful statement. His power came not from God or the Church, but from his own military and political achievements and from the will of the French people. The Pope was reduced to a mere spectator, a prop in a drama staged by Napoleon himself. The ceremony was a brilliant fusion of different historical traditions. The presence of the Pope recalled the coronations of the old French kings. The laurel wreath on Napoleon's head evoked the Caesars of Rome. And the entire affair was a celebration of a man who had risen to power through the revolutionary principle of careers open to talent. To complete his new imperial order, Napoleon created a new court and a new nobility. He established the Legion of Honor as the highest order of the state, rewarding distinguished service, both military and civilian. He made members of his family princes and princesses of the empire, and created a new imperial nobility. Dukes, counts, and barons, conferred not on the basis of ancient lineage, but as rewards for loyalty and service to the emperor. It was a strange and contradictory creation, an absolute hereditary monarchy that was, at its core, built on the revolutionary premise that a man's worth should be determined by his talent and achievement, not by birth. The Corsican artillery officer, the child of the revolution, was now the equal of any king in Europe. And the long, turbulent journey that had begun in the halls of Versailles ended on an imperial throne.
Inevitable legacy, light and shadow. The coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French in 1804 is, for most historians, the moment the curtain finally drops on the French Revolution. The chaotic 10-year drama that began with the tennis court oath and took the nation through a republic, the reign of terror, and the shambolic Directory now ended with the restoration of a hereditary absolute monarchy. On the surface, it seemed the revolution had come full circle, that the great struggle for liberty had failed, merely replacing a Bourbon king with a Corsican emperor. But to see it that way is to miss the profound and irreversible transformations that had taken place. Napoleon's empire was not the Ancien Regime. The old world had been destroyed beyond recall, and the legacy of the revolution, a complex and often contradictory set of ideas and institutions, had already begun to reshape not just France, but the entire world. The most immediate and undeniable legacy was the complete annihilation of the old feudal order in France. The complex pyramid of corporate privileges, with its 3 estates, its untaxed nobles, and its powerful clergy, was gone forever. The August Decrees and the Napoleonic Code created a new modern society based, at least in theory, on the principle of legal equality. A person's position was no longer determined by their birth, but by their talent and property.
This was the great triumph of the bourgeoisie, the class that in many ways started and ended the revolution. They secured a society where property was sacred, careers were open to talent, and the law applied equally to all, creating the social and legal framework for the rise of 19th century capitalism. The revolution also gave birth to modern politics. It was in the heated debates of the National Assembly that the very terms left and right were coined, based on the seating arrangement of the radical Jacobins, who sat to the president's left, and the more conservative monarchists, who sat to his right. The revolution was a melting pot of political ideologies. It gave the world its first real taste of liberalism, with its focus on constitutional rule and individual rights. It spawned modern conservatism in reaction to its successes, most articulately phrased by the British writer Edmund Burke. And it created the powerful new tradition of revolutionary radicalism, the belief that society could be totally remade from the ground up, according to a rational plan. The political clubs, the explosion of newspapers and pamphlets, and the constant feverish public debate created a new public sphere, a space where the affairs of the nation were the business of every citizen, not just the secret domain of the king and his ministers. And at the heart of this new political culture lay the powerful, transforming idea of popular sovereignty, the belief that the ultimate source of all political authority is not God or a dynasty, but the people themselves. Flowing directly from this was the emergence of modern nationalism. Before 1789, a peasant in Provence and a merchant in Paris had little in common besides their shared subservience to the same king. Their identity was local and regional. The revolution forged these disparate groups into a unified nation. Being a citizen of France became a powerful new identity. This sense of nationalhood was forged in the heat of battle, the threat of foreign invasion, the call for the levée en masse, mass conscription, that summoned all citizens to defend la patrie, the fatherland, and the singing of the new, stirring national anthem, the Marseillaise, all created a powerful emotional bond of national unity that had never existed before. This powerful new force of the people in arms, fighting not for a king, but for their nation, proved to be one of the revolution's most potent and often dangerous exports. The slogan and eternity: liberty, equality, fraternity. Of course, the revolution's legacy is a dual one. It is a story of both light and shadow. Its bright, enduring legacy is the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. Its proclamation of universal rights, liberty, equality, property, and security became the foundational text for liberal democracy across the globe. Every subsequent struggle for human rights, from the feminist movement to the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, owes an intellectual debt to the principles first articulated in 1789. But this legacy of liberty is forever shadowed by the dark inheritance of the Reign of Terror. The Terror gave a terrifying new blueprint for modern state power. It demonstrated how a small, determined group of ideologues could seize control of the state and use its centralized power to impose a utopian vision on society through violence and fear. The Committee of Public Safety, with its surveillance committees, its political show trials, and its use of terror as a deliberate instrument of state policy, was a chilling prelude to the totalitarian states of the 20th century. Thus, the revolution left the world with a profound and troubling question. How does a society secure liberty without descending into anarchy? And how does it achieve order without sacrificing that very liberty? This complex legacy was carried across Europe by Napoleon's armies. As they conquered, they brought with them the Napoleonic Code, the abolition of feudalism, and the principles of legal equality. They were both liberators and conquerors, sweeping away the old medieval order while imposing French domination. The ideas of the revolution inspired liberal and nationalist movements across the continent, from Germany and Italy to Poland and Spain. Furthermore, its example ignited the slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which would become the independent nation of Haiti, and it inspired the leaders of independence movements in Latin America, such as Simón Bolívar. The French Revolution was not merely a French event, it was a world historical event, a great turning point that, for better or worse, marks the beginning of the modern age. And so our long journey through the tumultuous, brilliant, and terrifying years of the French Revolution comes to an end. We have traveled from the glittering, sun-drenched halls of Versailles to the grim, torch-lit streets of rebellious Paris. We stood with the deputies in a humble tennis court, watched a medieval fortress fall to a mob of citizens, and heard the roar of the crowd as the king's head was held aloft. We witnessed the birth of sublime ideals and the descent into unimaginable terror. And we followed the path of a young Corsican general as he rose from obscurity to become the master of Europe. The revolution as a historical event was over. Its fires were banked, and its energy channeled into the creation of a new authoritarian empire. But the ideas it unleashed, the questions it raised, and the ghosts it summoned could not be so easily contained. They escaped the borders of France and the confines of their century, and they continued to whisper and argue in the very fabric of our modern world. The most enduring and universal legacy of the revolution can be found in its immortal slogan: liberty, equality, fraternity. These three words were not simply a motto, they were a political program, and the often difficult relationship between them has defined the great ideological battles of the last 200 years. Liberty, the great cry of 1789, has echoed in every subsequent movement for constitutional rule, for the rule of law, and for the protection of individual rights. The liberal tradition, with its emphasis on free speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from arbitrary state power, is the direct intellectual heir of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Equality, the great cry of the radical Jacobins in 1793, proved a more complex and contentious ideal. While the revolution succeeded in establishing permanent legal equality, the more radical Jacobin pursuit of social and economic equality, their attempts to control prices, redistribute wealth, and create a republic of virtue, failed. Yet this powerful idea has never gone away. The dream of a society free from vast inequalities of wealth and poverty would become the central inspiration for the great socialist and communist movements of the 19th and 20th century. The ongoing debates in our own societies about the role of the state in reducing inequality are a direct continuation of the argument that first erupted between the moderate Girondins and the radical Montagnards. And fraternity, the call for all citizens of the nation to see themselves as brothers, became the emotional heart of modern nationalism. It was a powerful force that bound the French people to defend their fatherland, but it also contained a darker potential. The passionate love for one's own nation could too easily turn into suspicion and hatred of others, feeding the aggressive, expansionist nationalism that would lead Europe into the catastrophic wars of the 20th century. The modern world is still grappling with the tension between these three ideals: how to balance the liberty of the individual with the demand for the equality of the collective, and how to harness the unifying power of fraternity without unleashing the destructive demons of xenophobia. The French Revolution also became a kind of archetypal script for all future revolutions. For the revolutionaries and political thinkers who came after, it was the definitive case study. Karl Marx, in developing his theory of class struggle, drew heavily on the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the sans-culottes. The Russian revolutionaries of 1917, especially Lenin, were obsessed with the French model. They consciously studied its phases, desperate to avoid the fatal turn of 9 Thermidor, where the revolution consumes its own. They saw their own moderate liberals as the Girondins, their Bolsheviks as the Jacobins, and were determined to be more ruthless than Robespierre to avoid his fate. The history of the French Revolution became a template, a series of stages: the moderate beginning, the radical turn, the terror, the eventual military consolidation, that political actors in countries from China to Cuba consciously sought either to repeat or subvert. And so, even now, the whispers of this great upheaval are all around us. It is present in the very language of our politics, in the concepts of left and right, human rights and national sovereignty. It is present in the continuing global struggle to build stable democracies, and in the debates we have every day about the proper relationship between the individual and the state. The story of the French Revolution is an enduring and often cautionary tale. It reminds us that the desire for liberty is one of the most powerful forces in human history, but that the path from an old, unjust world to a new, better one is often fraught with unexpected and terrible dangers. It shows us that even the most noble ideals can be perverted into tools of oppression, and that the line between a virtuous republic and a reign of terror can be perilously thin. As we conclude our story, perhaps it is best to picture that single iconic image from its very beginning: the deputies in the tennis court, their arms outstretched, taking a solemn oath to create a better world. Their faces filled with a mix of hope, determination, and a profound uncertainty about the future they were about to unleash. They could not know the long and winding road their revolution would take, the glories it would achieve, and the horrors it would commit. They only knew that the world they had inherited was no longer acceptable, and that they had the power and the duty to begin it anew. And now, as their story fades into the silence of the past, may the lessons of their struggle, their triumphs, and their failures guide you into a peaceful and deeply restorative sleep. Good night.